We're going to open the meeting. Thank you all for being here. The records will show that we do have a quorum of the EPAC here as of 1:10 today. The first item on our agenda, item B, is public comment regarding any item that is not on our agenda today. Is there any such comment? I see none. We will move to the approval of the minutes, which were in your packet for August 10th, 2015. Are there any comments on those minutes? If there are none, could I have a motion to approve them? Okay.
Second.
Member Lilly, seconded by Member Connolly. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? All right. We will go on to general business, item D. You have item D1, the calendar for the EPAC on page D.1-1, which shows meetings after today on September 28th, October 12th, October 26th, and December 7th. Those are all currently scheduled for 1:30. I can imagine by the end of today's meeting we may decide to move that to a 1 o'clock start time, but at this point it's at 1:30, 2 weeks from today, and then 2 weeks after that, the 12th and the 26th. I do want to point out, in case people wonder, that October 12th is the observed Columbus Day, but we are holding the meeting on that day, and it's been on the calendar for a while, but that's not a typo. Any questions about our calendar? Okay, item D.2 is the EPAC roster. That is now a finalized document. It's on pages D.2-1 through 2.3. I don't think there's anything for that other than an information item for you. Any questions about that? Okay, and then pages D.3-1 and following are your action log. We are not going to go through all 16 of those actions today. Most of them are closed, but we can take questions about them. I do want to point out the two open items, which are number 16 and 4, and we wanted to talk about those for just a minute or two. Actually, I think item 4 will go a little quicker, so I'll do that one first, just to let you know that we did not develop those alternative scenarios for this meeting. However, what we did, as I think you all know, is give you on the very last page of your packet 3 essentially existing scenarios for your consideration. Those are on page 2.2-2, and they include what would happen if simply Measure J were extended under the new sales tax measure, a proposal submitted by public advocates, and the proposal that is created by the combination of the work done by the 3 RTPCs. So we decided, at least for the time being, that those are sort of straw people. The 4 RTPCs, I'm sorry. 3 packages, one of which was prepared by 4 RTPCs. So those are starting points for today's discussion under item number 2. We can certainly do action item number 4, and we think we might end up doing it in preparation for the September 28th meeting, depending on your direction today. And so that item remains open, and we will see if you all want us to develop additional alternatives for the meeting on September 28th. We also wanted to talk briefly about action item number 16, which is the other open one. You all asked for analysis by the September 28th meeting, or at some meeting you asked for analysis of some of the alternatives. I wanted to clarify that what we're doing as part of this process is actually developing alternatives that will be evaluated in the EIR. And so that is one of the reasons for doing this creation of alternatives, is that 4 alternatives are being evaluated in the EIR, and there will be detailed evaluation of all the alternatives at that time. In advance of that, what we are able to provide is preliminary assessment of 3 of those 4 alternatives. And that's going to get underway as soon as the 3 alternatives are approved by the Authority Board. The Authority Board is doing that approval on Wednesday night. And listed on pages D.3-1 and 2, well, I guess it's just on 3.1, are 6 items that will be evaluated as part of that initial analysis. And you can see them there with the bulleted list on D.3-1. So that information is going to become available, as you requested, in time for your September 28th meeting. The remaining analysis will be done as part of the EIR process before any final TEP is selected by the authority in calendar year 2016. We do have for distribution today a summary of the 3 alternatives that have been drafted by staff, which will be considered in the EIR and which are going to be considered for that evaluation for September 28th. I believe that's on your desk. I see some of you looking at it now. We've just handed it out today. It's an 11 by 17 sheet with blue at the top, and that shows the 3 alternatives that are being evaluated. Those 3 alternatives do each total $6.9 billion. That, you will probably notice, is 3 times as big as the $2.3 billion that we've been assuming is part of the TEP, and that is because we believe that all TEP money will be leveraged through other sources, local, state, federal, whether it's highway funds or smart growth funds or carbon trading funds. There's a number of funding sources that are or are likely to become available over the life of the TEP. And for that reason, there is an assumption for purposes of the EIR that these programs will be leveraged to the tune of 3 times as great as what's in the TEP itself, and that's the basis for the magnitude of the programs that are being evaluated in the EIR, and hence will also be evaluated in the September 28th submittal to you. So that explains why each of these line items comes to $6.9 billion as opposed to $2.3 billion. You will also notice down at the very bottom that each of them comes to $10.3 billion, and that's because all of them also includes the $3.4 billion that's included in the RTP. And so that gets added to the 6.9 for a total of 10.3. So that gives you some background about that action item number 16 and where we stand on that, and the information, the preliminary evaluation that we'll be able to bring to you on September 28th. I see one hand already from Dave, but before I do that, Russ, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, excuse me, thank you. Russ Chittenden, Authority staff. In addition to this table, well, first let's talk a little bit more about the table. If you go to the far right column, you'll also see a column for the November 15 draft TEP. So again, the alternatives that will be analyzed for the EIR include the 4 alternatives that are listed on this sheet, plus a draft TEP that will be released by my board in November. In addition, for additional specificity, some of these rows are programs that need time to understand what they are, but for some of these rows where there are discrete projects, these maps up on the wall on this side of the room here correspond with each of those alternatives. So there's an RTP map, so that's the base that exists in the current regional transportation plan, and then programs and projects for each of the other alternatives on these maps. So it'll give you some additional definition of what will be analyzed.
And just to clarify further about the November 2015 draft, that's a draft TEP that will be based on input from you, that will go from you to the authority board. The authority board will make a selection of that preferred alternative, and that will be fed back into the EIR. So your input is a critical ingredient into the creation of that 5th alternative, which is the blank column on this blue chart. Dave Campbell, did you have a first question about this?
Yeah, can you explain, we were shown earlier a slide that said if Measure J reauthorization passes, that it will be something like 2/3 or 70% of all funding in Contra Costa County. And these scenarios assume that, yet it seems to be that the percentages here is more like 1/3 is Measure J. Can you explain or explain how that works?
I don't recall what you're referring to. Can you talk a little bit more about what you recall seeing?
Yeah, it was a pie chart that showed if Measure J passes, what percentage of all transportation money in Contra Costa County will be funded through Measure J.
And when you say Measure J, you mean the old Measure J?
Both.
And
this seems to suggest, I haven't done the math yet, but it seems to suggest 1/3 would be Measure J.
Well, and that's one of the inputs, is what you're talking about, if I think I understand or know what you're talking about, projects historically have leveraged 3 to 1. I think that's, Measure J for projects was 1/4 of the slice of the pie, and then there were 3/4 filled in with other money? Is that?
No, it had, J was, say, 3/4,
Oh,
and
3/4.
state was 2/3 of the rest. Federal was 1/3 of the rest. And it shows that, Measure J is most of the money here. This is consistent with Alameda County as well.
Okay, I think I know. So this, the one you're talking about is breaking out local, state, and federal, and local is 62%. So that includes, and that's statewide for all the measures. That includes sales tax funding, it includes toll funding, it includes locally generated funds, like in our county with the ECRFA fee program. So that's not just measure money, that's all local monies, and in the Bay Area, the bulk of that is probably bridge toll money.
So it is consistent, it sounds like you're saying.
I think it's consistent, yeah, it's well, it's an apples and oranges, and I think we could make the connection, but yeah, it's Measure J is a subset of that big wedge.
All right, any other questions about this particular item or the action item log in general? All right, we are moving along quickly. So the remainder of our agenda has 2 items on it, and those are the 2 big discussion items for today. The first is the expenditure plan, vision, goals, and objectives, and then the second is development of the transportation expenditure plan itself, and that one breaks into both policy considerations and the discussion of the expenditure item dollar amounts. It's my hope that we can get to that last item, item 2.2, by about 2 o'clock, 35 minutes from now. I'm hoping that, maybe that's a little ambitious, but somewhere between 2 or certainly by 2:30, that we can get to that item and move through these other 2 very quickly. This is not a timed agenda. We're going to take whatever time is necessary, but I thought that my understanding is that most of you are especially interested in moving to the discussions about the dollar amounts in the expenditure plan, and so I thought I'd put forward my personal goal that we might be able to move through those other items relatively quickly. Does anybody want to comment on that notion of timing, or shall we just dive into it and see where we go?
Well, actually, yeah, one
Yeah.
thing.
Yes, Seth.
And it's sort of preliminary to the discussion of vision, goals, and objectives. And Ron Brown from, say, Mount Diablo was one of the people really pushing for a discussion of that. And I know that staff is aware of this concern, but today is Rosh Hashanah, and so he's not able to be a part of the discussion that he thought was one of the most important things that we could be doing. And I wanted to register that. And I think one of the upcoming dates is also on Columbus Day, and I don't know whether some people are going to be affected by that federal holiday in some way, but we're really sorry he couldn't be part of today's vision discussion. I'll fill in his wake in a little bit, to some small extent.
Okay. And we do apologize. We are aware that today is one of the Jewish High Holy Days, and I mentioned just a few minutes ago that we are meeting on Columbus Day also. So this is an important process, and I think one that most of us agree just needs to move forward, but we do know that there have been scheduling conflicts for several people in several different fronts. Okay, so we'll try and move forward then, moving this along, and the first agenda item is the vision and goals, and that's page 1-1 in your packet. It's about 2/3 of the way through the packet, and has a cover memo followed by 2 pages on 1-2 and 1-3, which are a preliminary statement of vision, goals, and objectives, which was put together by the staff and consultant team, and then attached to that, starting on page 1-4, all the way through page 1- what is the official numbers? 18, 17? 1-18 are a total of 8 letters that were received from constituent organizations that make up the EPAC with ideas for this document. It's been our intention to encompass all of the commonly held visions, goals, and objectives that appeared in those 8 letters in this 2-page document. And what I'd like to do right now is open it up for your discussion about this 2-page document with the intention that we could agree on this vision and this list of goals as a guiding framework for the work that we are going to do together. And before we do that, I do want to acknowledge Ron Brown in particular as the person who really suggested that this would be an important process to engage in, and I think we as staff and consultants very much agreed that having this as a document, whatever it might evolve to, should serve as a very good touchstone for the work that you all will do as you move forward. Russ.
One other quick comment as someone who worked on this document. It incorporates information from the letters that were received since the last meeting, but to the extent possible, we also tried to incorporate some of the information that came out in that introductory session where we asked you to talk about what was important to you in the process and why you were engaged. So it's a combination of that and the letters.
And with that, I'll open it up to any comments you all have. Catherine. Yeah, and we do want to try and use the microphones. I appreciate, Catherine, you trying to get one.
Yeah, I think I was maybe perhaps missed the first meeting with the introductory comments, but my comment is simple in that I would request that as we prepare the vision, there's a discussion and a mention of open space and sustained biological diversity. I would also like to see agricultural lands called out there as something, you know, I'm sure that, you know, it was meant to be included in open space, but I'd like to see it called out as a land type that has a special, offers special benefits. And then I guess it's the 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet point down says proactively link transportation and land use planning to promote sustainable communities. I would like to add in there also link transportation, land use planning, and the protection of open space and agricultural lands in that bullet.
Okay, and what I will do is make notes of these on my own paper as we move forward, and if it seems as though we're developing a consensus in favor of the document overall, I'll read back the proposed changes, Catherine's and any others, and make sure that we have consensus on those before we move forward. Are there other comments? Sean.
Debbie was before me.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, okay. I was just going to add that bullet point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I feel like it's missing the word efficient, and I would suggest that maybe that be added. I know it's a 4th word that normally a 3 should sum up, but convenient doesn't really encompass efficiency to me.
Debbie, did you have something?
I did.
Okay, well, Debbie and then Dave.
So I think that we may be missing something of the word inclusive in places throughout here. So I look around the room and I look at all the people involved, and every entity here has a reason to be here and somebody or some way to speak to. And I think that inclusion needs to be sort of an underlying concept in what we create together, and we also need to make sure that whatever it is that we create as this body is included, since I'm using inclusive, in whatever the plan ends up being, that there's inclusion of everybody's perspective. And I will say that, at least from my perspective, there are a few of us who actually work in the realm of truly accessible transportation for people with disabilities and seniors. Most of us just work in service in some aspect, whether it's food service, health service, social service, whatever. So we're not experts the same way that an engineer might be, or the same way that somebody who understands the land and the impact of transportation on that land may be. And that the people that we often serve are people with developmental disabilities, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, things like that. And so they don't really have the same kind of voice. You look at all the letters of support you see from somebody, and I just want to make sure that we aren't guided solely by those who have a voice, but by those who get impacted by the use of transportation in Contra Costa.
Great. So, Debbie, if I could ask you, I would note that there's one spot in here I see that does mention at least physical abilities, and that's the second bullet. And I think what you're saying is you'd like to see that issue widen not only to physical abilities, but other types of ability as well, and that you'd like to see it maybe appear in a couple more places. Could I ask you maybe somehow, assuming we're going to move forward with this, that you maybe we take a short break at some point or something, and maybe you could come up with a couple places you'd like to see that included? If we do want to move this forward today, that would enable us to include your input and then move it forward. So maybe you could come up with some specific suggestions.
Okay.
Great. Dave? Well, yeah, after Dave.
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
like a lot of these bullets, and having gone through transportation plan developments before, I still don't see how these bullets are going to help us make decisions going forward. In a way, a vision could help us make decisions going forward. There seems to be something here for everyone, and I'm curious, for those who are transportation planners smarter than me, how does a list that seems to capture something that everybody would want, how does it help us make decisions going forward?
Do you want to speak to that before I do?
Be my guest. Well, I think, you know, I, as we were going through and saying the fourth bullet, fifth bullet, I wrote a number by each one, and there's 15 bullets if you haven't counted them. You know, maybe what you're getting at is that you could probably condense these down to half a dozen or so. There's probably a number that are somewhat related. But I think, you know, I don't necessarily view this as a way to, you know, throw something on the table and count that, well, it fits in 10 of these, and if it fits 10, it's better than 8. So, you know, I think it's really geared at, you know, do we have a convergence of thought process of what should be in it? So I don't know if that's kind of the way you're thinking, David.
I guess, Dave, what I would add to that is that this, from my opinion, is intended to create the broad foundation from which the EPAC is going to work. And it's actually purposely written in a way to capture things that I think most of you, despite a variety of points of view, would support. And at the same time, it does give guidance. It mentions that we're looking, you know, from the beginning for efficiency, safety, and reliability. We're trying to consider all modes. We're trying to make sure that we do look for efficiency. We're trying to incentivize compact, higher density development. We're trying to achieve widespread voter support. Those are just a few things that are written in here, and I think that those do then preclude a whole host of options. The universe of possible things of possible TEPs that fits within this is certainly still large, but you would not be looking at a TEP, for instance, that would not be popular with the voters. You would not be looking at a TEP that would not incentivize compact higher density development. So you've got a host of items listed in here that do provide guidance, and yet this is not intended to be the thing that you can point at and say, well, because of this that we just adopted, we now have a single TEP before us. We know exactly what it will include. That's still going to require quite a bit of discussion, and yet this does provide a foundation and a direction moving forward.
Well, I'll just say I think going forward, when the discussion comes down to things that are included in the TEP, there's probably going to be some things suggested that look like business as usual, or at least things we've seen in the past. And a list of bullets like this that capture a little bit of everything, including things we've seen in the past, helps encourage more of the same. And I don't know that the goal of getting a vision, I think the goal of getting a vision was to help change course a little bit. So I'm just throwing it out there. I've seen bullets like this before that have not helped direct decision-making. And I think we could come up with some bullets that do if we want to and if we can.
Well, I think all of us, I can't speak for the committee members, but certainly from a staff and consultant perspective, the reason we've brought this to you is for you all to be able to identify additional items that you might want to see, or perhaps even to direct us to start all over. The first 3 or 4 comments seem to suggest that there was generally support for this among the first few speakers and that they wanted to see some fine tuning. But if the EPAC either wants us to take a totally different look, or if the EPAC would like to add numerous bullets that you may be alluding to that would add additional guidance here, you can consider that as well, and that's exactly what this discussion is intended to do. Howell?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is certainly, I mean, I recognize Dave's point. I mean, and I think that I'd like to hope that we can get to a place where we can actually develop language that would offer some criteria when it comes to evaluating projects based on discretionary funding opportunities and what have you. I hope that's what you're speaking to, right? Like developing something that would help us figure out like how money should be spent. Is that what you're speaking to, Dave? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I would reiterate that I would support that idea as well. Like, you know, fluffy stuff is wonderful, but I think that we certainly are going to need some kind of a mechanism that would offer us robust criteria so that when we have discretionary funding or competitive funding to be allocated to different projects, we should be able to develop a solid source of criteria that reflects all of these intentions, I would hope. The point that I wanted to make specifically about the language that I see in the vision and in these bullets, the one little tweak that I think that was missed from the comments that we submitted was the idea that in order to be able to get people, to be able to develop a system for the 21st century, we need to get more folks out of cars. And the way that we do that is not just by providing convenient options, but by making sure that those convenient options are actually competitive with the car. And I don't see the word competitive with the car expressly. I don't see competitive out there, but travel times that are effectively competitive with the car, which will act as an incentive. A lot of us take BART because, frankly, it's faster now to jump in on BART than it is to drive. I think if it wasn't the case, most of us wouldn't be taking BART. I think, and I'm confident that there are things that we can do to our transit systems, especially on some of the higher capacity corridors, to make transit faster, buses faster than car travel times, and that kind of competitiveness will actually get us to a transportation system that can truly accommodate the growth that we all hope to achieve here in Contra Costa County.
All right, thank you. So again, I'm keeping notes, and for that one, Debbie, for yours, I wasn't able to figure out exactly where to insert that. For yours, Joel, I'm just made a note to perhaps on that 5th bullet, add the word competitive and add a clause about travel times, and we can come back to that if we move it forward, but I have some language written down. And Debbie, I'm going to come back to you still towards the end of this discussion. Other comments? I think you may be next. Joel, and then Margaret and Mike. Oh, sure, sorry.
Thank you very much, and thanks for putting this together. I appreciate that. On the vision piece, want to recognize Catherine Ledan's addition of agriculture, as well as the sentence that starts with a TEP would provide incentives for dense development. I understand that this is probably an early work of trying to collect all the things that a TEP would do, but I would like to see under the second part of that, support for projects and programs that help create local jobs and economic sustainability. I'd like to see it say something like and honor growth management in the county, because they're, yeah, or to, yeah, and or respect the urban limit lines, something like that. Under the list of bullet points, number 3 is the only one that recognizes the growth management components, and I think that it's really weak. Just says recognize that transportation, but it doesn't say anything about proactively make investments to both recognize growth management as it is stands today and enhancements to that, which is what many of us would like to see in a future sales tax. So perhaps there's another bullet point that would be needed as in addition to that, if that's a different direction folks would like to go. And then also number 4, I'd like to see it say something like proactively link transportation, land use planning, and ag and open space preservation to promote sustainable communities through performance measures to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. So
Can you read that last one again?
ending sentence 4 with something like through performance measures to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. Also, greenhouse gas reductions only ends up here in bullet point 6 about healthy living and active transportation. That's not the only way that you can achieve greenhouse gas reductions. That's it for now. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.
Next is Margaret.
Yes, bullet 7, within reach, can we just be specific and say walkable?
I think that's for affordability for housing.
Yeah, it's within reach for all income levels, so.
Oh, I see, I'm sorry.
So is that okay to leave it
Yeah,
as this? Okay. Mike?
And, one
Oh,
more.
go ahead.
And 8, create permanent quality jobs?
Okay. Mike Cunningham, I believe you're next. Microphone's there with Sean and Debbie.
So I had a couple of brief sort of nitpicky comments about things that are here, and then one comment about a thing that's not here. In a couple of places, bullet 1 and bullet, I don't know what this is, 10 maybe, it states an objective to support efficient movement, support movement of people, which sounds to me like a pretty weak goal to support. We have substantial mobility challenges in the region with significant impacts on economic opportunity and economic growth, and I would think a more appropriate goal is significant improvement of some stated in some way rather than just support.
So are you suggesting a change to which bullet?
I'm not wordsmithing it, but
Okay.
I would be more comfortable with a goal that feels more like an outcome than simply support, right? And then that second one I cited, which might be around number 10, says support movement of people and goods with a robust and connected transit system and increase vehicle occupancy. I don't really know what that has to do with movement of goods. Movement of goods is important to be supported, but I'm not sure what transit system and increased vehicle occupancy have to do with that. Somewhere around roughly number 8, 7 or 8, says incentivize compact higher density development, which certainly is something that Bay Area Council members and the business community in general support. However, our concern and support are a little bit broader than that, not just incentivizing compact higher density development, but there's such a housing shortage with such negative implications, again, on economic opportunity, on the ability for our transportation system to work well, to create jobs, et cetera. Then we think that, a goal of just increasing, supporting, facilitating, encouraging, incentivizing increased production of housing. This seems to be saying, we're picking one kind of housing over another, and again, we certainly support high-density infill, but even as a broader goal, we simply support the production of more housing. And let's say the production of more housing in the right places, respecting the urban limit lines and agreeing where not to build. But where we agree to build, I think we want to very aggressively encourage production. And then finally, not referenced here, something that our members as employers think about or complain about a lot, which is that at least most commute trips, and probably a large share of trips overall, cross jurisdictional lines, either cities or counties. And in a number of transportation improvement areas, there seems to be there's a degree of balkanization between counties or cities, counties, and transportation districts. And our members have been saying for quite a while that it's important to have both physical transportation improvements that are coordinated and consistent across jurisdictional lines, as well as transit services that are coordinated and consistent across operating agency lines. So, for example, on the transportation improvements like arterial signal coordination or ramp metering are often kind of done on a city-by-city basis, while the corridors and the trips cross those. So I would, I'd encourage a goal that suggests that we're going to break down those jurisdictional boundaries and deliver improvements that respect the trips made by people rather than the jurisdictions that oversee the land.
Okay, Debbie, I saw your hand, and then we'll take Terry.
Oh, I was trying to tell you he was talking about bullet number 1, but he
Oh.
wasn't. But number 1 should be included where he was talking about changing that word, so that.
Okay.
But you can come back to me because I have other thoughts, but in
Okay,
order.
Terry?
Ours is just a real quick one. I just want to ensure that schools are somehow represented in these goals. I think bullet number 2 can get to that, but we just want to make sure, both Tim and I talked about this prior to our meeting today, that in some way, shape, or form, K-14 school sites, that we somehow promote access to safe schools in our communities, both through infrastructure as well as programs. And we have some thoughts and ideas around those, but it just doesn't, it's not reflected in here, and just wanted to throw our 2 cents in.
Kristen?
I just want to echo some of Mike's comments just in terms of the need to really increase our housing stock and the recognition of where we need to build in the right places, and some of the language I think that he was including there is certainly important to our members and something that we're talking about, and that there should be explicit policy links to how all of these dollars flow, and we can talk about that more in our next section. And I'm being mindful, you want us to get there by 2 o'clock. But I did want to underscore that. And I think, to Dave's comments at the top, I think that, words matter, and coming together with, these bullets and this prefatory statement, we shouldn't wordsmith as a group. But I think that aspirational language matters a lot, and it goes back to that, that we are seeking to do something here that is compelling to voters. And I want us to avoid the temptation that too often happens in inside baseball, where people think that, of course there's going to be a half cent, and isn't everybody think that's great and more is better, and so let's just double it and add 30, convert it like a conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius or vice versa. I think that it's important to have a compelling vision so that we have a really good answer to the question about why it is that we're doing this. And so I do want us to, I'm really sorry that Ron can't join us, because I thought that, his comments at our prior meeting about the importance of doing this were really important. So I think that we should take these into account, revisit this, and continue to tweak it when we're together, and that it does help us guide our work.
Okay, I see Peter and Debbie.
You go. No, you go. Then I'll go.
Debbie wants the last word.
Always.
Apologies for coming late. I hope this doesn't duplicate what people have said already. The first 2 points are so general as to be meaningless. They're certainly pious, but they don't really advance the discussion in any way. And particularly, I think these points should show an aspiration to change, to move off the existing pattern of extraordinary reliance on automobiles. And none of these sort of indicate where they represent continuation of the status quo and where they represent change. And it seems to me that they probably should indicate where they represent doing something differently from before. And also, in general, the whole set of targets should be a change document, not a status quo document. and be explicit about that. Down must be towards 7 or 8. Promote a healthy lifestyle and greenhouse gas reduction is grossly underplayed. First place, its numerical position on the list. Mixing the greenhouse gas issues, which is the question of our age, ranked number 7, and mixing it with other points it raises the question of let's wake up and realize what day and age we're in. And then I'd like to endorse and second what Kristen said and what Mike said about the imperative need for housing. Huge structural problem for the Bay Area, and certainly for Contra Costa County, is the cost of housing, which affects everything coming down to the daily life of citizens that we're working for. And then I would stress, perhaps somewhat more than they would, not only do we need quantitatively more housing, but it should indeed go on transit, and it should indeed have walking access to transit. So around the transit stations, and I'm thinking primarily of heavy rail transit, you don't have acres of parking, but you have real serious concentration of population into communities with easy, safe walking to the transit. Thanks.
I'll add or wheeling to the transit to that for people who use wheelchairs to get around. So either we can add another bullet because we don't have enough, or we can amend number 2 to be really busy, but create safe, convenient, and affordable, accessible, inclusive transportation. All of that stuff needs to be in there, however you want to do it. Have at it, but if you wanted to make a second bullet point, you might just pull out that we need to provide accessible, inclusive transportation for people of all abilities. And that sort of looks at finance, cognitive, physical, what have you. I would also recommend that there be one sentence that we could all say that we agree to, that we're you can have all the bullet points in the fluff and you can have a really long vision, but is there a basic thing that we're trying to achieve, a transportation expenditure plan that is inclusive of stakeholders who live and thrive in Contra Costa, or something that is a very basic thing that you could kind of go back and look at as you're making decisions? Does this fall under that? A guiding principle? I don't know what you want to call it, but I think I'm with Kristen that it may not happen, may not be birthed today, but that as we continue to work, we can continue to shape and formulate. And I would say that I want to just call out that we should probably have in our vision too that we are getting rid of sort of supporting, and we are promoting or doing, or some sort of action, creating a more inclusive system that is better equipped to care for our environment and the people in it, or something along the lines that incorporates that we're doing something differently than we're doing today. I would agree with previous sentiments on that.
All right, Mike.
Are you trying to wrap, you're trying to wrap this discussion up, right?
I'm going to try and do that very soon,
all
and I
right,
have some
well,
ideas how to do it.
Apologies. So no intention here to provoke another cycle of the conversation, but just a thought that's come to me over listening to the past few speakers, and especially Kristen's comment that we need to have a compelling vision to put before Contra Costa County voters, as well as some of the comments about business as usual not being an option. This really, I mean, I think it is true that we are at the time and at the beginning of a period that's going to be substantively different from decades prior, and there might be some way to package a vision and supporting programs and projects and expenditures around fulfilling that vision that recognizes that we're entering sort of a different era in which things that are different about this era, we're really going to have to deal with climate change. We're going to be presented with radical improvements in information technology and robotics and stuff like that that are going to impact transportation. We're going to have continuation of the trend of an aging population, but entering, I think, levels that are going to have really significant impacts and needs on how we plan for housing and transportation. And lastly, I don't know if this is really so much of the kind of epical transformation, but we really are in a time right now of critical housing shortage, and it's probably nothing that's going to change over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. It's going to magically solve housing, so I think it's probably going to remain as much of a challenge and imperative over the period as well. So maybe there's a way to package kind of things like that together into a vision about, we're entering a future in a very positive way, but one in which we're going to need to do some things differently.
Okay. I am going to try and move us along, so I'm going to ask now who are the last people who want to talk. Lisa? Who else? Seth? And that's going to be it. Lisa? And I do have an approach to suggest, but we'll let Lisa and Seth go first.
An approach is good. I would like to echo some of the comments that Mike and Kristen made as well. And I guess at its core, when I look at this list, one of my reactions is that, we should, and perhaps the development of a more specific vision statement, as Debbie alluded to, may be helpful, because we don't want to make the mistake of trying to solve all of our problems in one measure. We have many challenges, many things that we can do to promote transportation. This is at its core a transportation measure, so I would urge us to try to resist the attempt to make this be a fix for many things, because of course it cannot be. And reference to the housing issue made me think of that, because clearly we have a huge housing shortage. Simply incentivizing housing through a few dollars here and there through the transportation program is not going to solve that problem. But we can do things in this measure not to make it harder, not to make it more expensive, not to make it more difficult and have more burden or barriers to construction of housing through this process. So that would be my comments.
Seth?
Yeah, I want to start with just a couple of wordsmithing items, and then sort of add two sort of overall bullets in a sense. So in bullet 3, recognize that transportation investments have impacts on all land types in the county, and take steps to, here's my addition, strengthen our urban limit lines, manage and mitigate the impacts of growth, and expand CCTA's growth management program. And to second Catherine and Joel in the inclusion of agricultural land as an important item to protect and mitigate for. In terms of the overarching goals, the vision for this thing, I agree with almost everything everyone has said. And so part of my vision is that we, here we go, improve and transform our transportation system to protect and enhance both our environment and our economy to improve our quality of life. And that's sort of my overarching statement of how we want to use this plan to make it transformational, that we really do need a game changer here to address the challenges before us and also the opportunities, but that we can do those and we can balance those things. And then, so improve and transform our transportation system to protect and enhance both our environment and our economy to improve our quality of life. Because when you get down to item 3, where it says have an impact on all land types, recognize that transportation investments have an impact on all land types, I think that's actually too limited. It has an impact on all land types, on all residents, and on our quality of life. And we need to address all of those things. And then my final bullet, number 16, would this draft TEP should represent a constrained plan which sets priorities to achieve these goals, evaluates projects, programs, and policies, and discourages ones which work against these goals, and includes transparency and public oversight to achieve these priorities and to accomplish this plan. A big part of what the environmental review is showing us, a big part of what we're seeing in terms of needing to maintain our existing infrastructure as well as to achieve this transformation is that we can't have a plan which includes everything everybody wants. We have to make some choices. We have to set some priorities. And we have to use this huge amount of funding to help us do those things. And without evaluating and setting priorities, without having a process to do that on an ongoing basis, and without doing it in a transparent way, which includes public oversight in a very significant way, not just of elected officials, but of stakeholders, the public, et cetera, it'll be difficult to do that.
Seth, can I ask you to copy those two new things, the both improve and expand and the represent a constrained plan, those two full thoughts onto a piece of paper and hand them to me?
Happy to do that.
Thank you. Well, so I would propose the following, and I think there's a fundamental question. We could either bring this back to you to look at next time, and or I could read to you a series of changes. Almost everything I think you all have talked about are actually things I think most of you would support, maybe with a couple of exceptions. But I did keep pretty careful notes here. I can go through all the changes that I think you all have made, and you could vote on it now. Or I can read them and you could direct that we bring it back to you to vote on next time, or you could simply direct now that we bring it back to vote on next time. Which of those things would you like to do?
Option 3. Your third option.
Third option.
Bring it
So
back.
not try and do any more of it now, just bring back all of these comments for your discussion at your next meeting.
And I want to emphasize discussion.
Discussion as well as action, yes.
Could you circulate those changes through email and we can bring it up next time?
Of course, we will give you, as we do all the time, an entire packet before the next meeting. So that packet will be out in roughly a week, because the meeting's only 2 weeks from now. Peter? We can try and do that. I can't make any promises that it will be earlier than the time the packet comes out. And of course, under the Brown Act, we cannot hold a serial meeting. You can certainly give us additional comments, which we can attempt to incorporate, but I'm going to focus on the comments that you all have made here today.
Dave.
Yes.
So the process here would be that all of the various comments that have been made, suggestions, et cetera, to these bullet points would come back to us, and we would have a discussion at the next meeting about which of these points we do or do not support and come to some consensus. Is that the idea? Because there have been some things said that, my members would agree with, and some things that have been said they will not. So I wouldn't want my silence at this moment on certain things to be mistaken for agreement.
I certainly understand that. The tenor of the comments in general has been, at least that the document with which we started, seemed to garner the support of most members. And I think maybe we should just verify that. I mean, we are going to be working from this document. So if it's not the case that you are comfortable beginning with this document and making what have essentially been a series of tweaks today, I think we should know that now. I do know that the two things that I was very aware of as the discussion continued were, on the one hand, allusions to strengthening the growth management program, which may not be supported by all of you, and there were also comments that said that we should enhance production of housing of all types in all places within the urban limit line. I'm not sure that would be supported by all of you. I'm not sure that those two sets of comments will reach a consensus of this group. Other than those comments, my personal feeling was that you all were beginning with a comfort level with the document as stated and making otherwise fine-tunings to it. And if I'm wrong about that, I think we should know that now. So let me ask the question. Are you all comfortable, with the possible exception of the two items about enhancement of growth management and enhancement of housing in all areas, are people generally comfortable with the things that you heard otherwise? Both the starting point here and the overall direction of the other comments? Bob?
Well, I would just like to say that it's hard for me to imagine anyone finding fault with the concepts that are mentioned here, but they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist vis-a-vis the policies that we're going to be discussing next and so forth. And my second comment would be that as we all know, the devil is firmly entrenched in the details, and there's a lot of terrific ideas, and we've covered almost all aspects of transportation, short of maybe astral projection. But I think how we do that is that's where we're going to find the real lift.
So despite the vision, what's really important is what's actually included in the expenditure plan.
Seth, what did you do?
The devil's in the details.
Yeah.
Is that a bolt of lightning coming your way, Seth?
So, Bob, is that an adequate summary of what was Seth's statement? An adequate summary of your point that the devil will be in the details of what goes in the TEP and potentially in any policies that go along.
Yes, I would say policies without direction are not worthwhile, and direction without formative policies also only half the loaf. So.
All right, Kristen, did you have a comment?
No, just that maybe we'll find out what that sound was. Maybe that's a sign that we're supposed to move on.
Could be.
I would just briefly say that, I'm in support of most of the various tweakings. I would have to probably see them repeated to me in front of me again to know if there was something in particular. I would not support the addition of specifically calling for strengthening the growth management policy in the vision. I think the reference to the fact that we have to and must account for our growth management through the vision is an important thing, and one we would completely agree with. But I believe the subtext to the discussion about strengthening the urban limit line and growth policies has a whole nother set of content to it that will have to come in the later discussions. And so, that's where we would be on that.
All right. So what I hear in the silence otherwise is that, yes, the typed document is a pretty good starting point. Yes, most of the additions are ones that people will support. We will need to have either some tempering or considerable discussion before we add things about either growth management or enhancement to the overall housing production situation, and that all of that should come back for discussion at our next meeting. Joel has one quick thing.
Just in that if we do disagree about these things, I'd like them not to have been eliminated entirely. I don't want growth management to disappear from this document because there's disagreement. That's if we reach some consensus, that'd be great. But I wouldn't support this document if, by consensus, we remove things that are inherent to our current sales tax measure.
Right. So our job is going to be to try and find some language about growth management and housing production that are workable for all of you. All right, we have achieved what we're going to achieve today on item 1. And we will move to item 2. And item 2 has a first part, which is a discussion about growth management. The first part of this, so this aspect of today's agenda, both items 2.1.1 and 2.1.2, it is my goal, I think our goal at staff and consultant level, to keep this at a relatively high level today. We want to accomplish two things. One is that Martin Engelman is going to give us a presentation about growth management, and then under item 2.1.2, we are going to essentially brainstorm and highlight the items that need to be discussed in the future. We are not going to try and resolve those items today. But I think it will be an important discussion just to let all of us know the various points of view in the room, and those started to surface already, I think, as to the extent to which and the nature of the extent to which the growth management program might be or not be augmented or enhanced through this new sales tax measure. So in order to set the stage to do that, and just to have that identification in 2.1.2. At your request, we've asked Martin Engelman to give a presentation here in 2.1.1 about the growth management program. You're probably aware that the GMP was part of the original Measure C, which was adopted in 1988, and it was carried forward into Measure J, although it was unchanged in Measure J of 2004. So it remains in effect through 2034 right now, unless it's amended, because it was reenacted by the voters with Measure J in 2004. So Martin is here today to talk about what's in that program and what its successes to date have been. That will be item 2.1.1, and then we will open it up for discussion among all of you to identify if and to what extent you would like to see that program changed or enhanced through the new measure. Martin.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, EPAC members. Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I'm Martin Engelman, Deputy Executive Director for Planning at the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to share with you information about the Growth Management Program. And David, I will mention that the Growth Management Program did evolve a little bit in 2004 when the voters re-upped Measure C, or Measure J.
I just said that to see who was paying attention.
So I guess the first question is why growth management and why in Contra Costa? And to answer that question, we need only look back at what was going on in transportation in the 70s and 80s, the 2 decades running up to this 1988 measure. Well, population in Contra Costa during the 70s and the 80s went from about 500,000 to over 800,000, and that was more than a 50% increase. And in 1988, the year that Measure C was approved by the voters, housing production in Contra Costa was 8,100 units for that year. That's about 25% of the Bay Area's total housing production, and that level has not been seen since. We haven't come anywhere near close to that. In 2009, it was down at 1,200 per year. Traffic, housing, and air quality issues were tantamount. There was a huge increase in traffic congestion, especially at the on Route 4 and at the I-80 State Route 24 interchange, which at the time had only one lane in certain directions. And there was a lack of mitigations. Housing projects were being built, but roadways weren't being improved. And there was a dearth of state and federal funding. Housing prices were skyrocketing during those 2 decades leading up to 1988. They went from 50,000 to 200,000 in nominal dollars. And the question was, where will our workforce live? Where will our teachers and nurses and policemen and firemen live? At the time, CO2 was not on the table yet. We were less concerned about that and more concerned about tangible air pollution, toxic fumes, and the kind of smog that you could actually see and smell. And that was those things drove us to developing a sales tax measure. So there was a sales tax measure in 1986. It was a half-cent measure, and it did not include a growth management program. It was a kind of a singular approach at sending funds towards projects and programs, and failed. In 1988, Measure C had a multifaceted approach, and it had some principles and underpinnings that we carry with us to this day. It had a cooperative planning process to establish on a countywide basis a way for local jurisdictions to discuss their land use decisions. And it had these themes that new development should pay to mitigate impacts on traffic and services, and the billions of dollars in sales tax were to construct projects that would fix the sins of the past, the development that had taken place in the past, and that the growth management program would prevent this from all happening over again, and new development would mitigate the impacts it creates for the future. So it passed in '88 by 54%, and it was carried forward in 2004 as the Measure J program, with the major change being that we added the urban limit line. So how does it work? First of all, it's a carrot, it's not a stick, and the carrot is money, and the money is for local streets and roads, and more recently also for the transportation for livable communities. So to be eligible to receive 18% local street maintenance and improvement funds and 5% TLC, local jurisdictions have to be in compliance with the growth management program. And those compliance requirements, as written in the measure, are in your packet. You're looking at the Measure J GMP. It's numbered 1 through 7. And every year, or rather every 2 years, we send out a checklist, and that checklist asks, did you, the local jurisdictions, comply with those 7 things that are listed in the measure? And I'm going to go through those 7 things now. So the first thing that local jurisdictions have to do is to adopt a growth management element. And state law requires that every city have a general plan, and there are certain elements included in that by law: the circulation, the transportation, land use, noise, safety. But state law also allows jurisdictions to include elements that are not listed in state law. So Measure J requires this new element, the growth management element. And that's really in the heart of Measure J. So to implement this, we've built a Measure J growth management element that's a model of how local jurisdictions' growth management elements should look. And we did this both for Measure C and for J. And for those of you who really want to get into this and you want to read the element, it is on our website in the library. You know, it's a question of how do we keep all the jurisdictions on board with this growth management program. It's fairly complex. There are all these requirements. And as you probably know, there's been a lot of staff turnover, especially in the planning department. So whenever a new staffer comes along and says, what's with this growth management program? I tell them, go to your general plan and read your growth management element. And that's really where the local jurisdictions buy into Measure C and Measure J. That's where they write down what they're going to do for the growth management program. And that's one of the questions on the checklist. Does the local jurisdiction have an adopted growth management element that substantially conforms with the authority's model growth management element? So we've really integrated growth management into what I would call the operations manual for every city and town in the county. And it speaks to all the topics that follow. So moving on to number 2, adopt a development mitigation program. This is a program where new development pays to mitigate the traffic impacts generated by that development. It's the future growth, not the past sins, but the future growth that the developers are supposed to mitigate. So Measure J requires both a local and a regional mitigation program, and each city has its own local program, and each sub-area has a regional program that focuses mainly on our arterials, what we call our routes of regional significance, where they're 20% of the lane miles, but they're 80% of the congestion is on these regional routes. We attempted initially to have one uniform fee for the whole county, but that did not fly, and so now we have each sub-area has its own fee, and probably if you were to ask me which sub-area has the most aggressive fee, I'd say in East County, Transplan, where those fees right now are at $18,000 per home for regional mitigation, and they've generated more than $200 million. The program as a whole has generated $250 million since its inception. Obviously, the Great Recession slowed housing growth. The Great Recession also reduced the fee revenue significantly since no new houses were started. So next item is item 3, address housing options. And this gets to the question of, you know, where will our workforce housing live? I mentioned that housing prices were really skyrocketing back in the 80s. That concern continues, I think, to this day. Where is the supply of affordable housing? And I can remember one of the first meetings I attended back in 1990. One of our Citizens Advisory Committee members stood up from Moraga and said, you know, there's going to come a point in time where you won't be able to buy a house in Moraga anymore for under $100,000. So the issue is workforce housing, and for this element, the cities have to demonstrate that they have plans in place to meet the requirements for housing by income level as specified by the regional agency and in accordance with state housing law. And this gets us to the famous Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which is released by ABAG, and each jurisdiction has to show that they have plans in place to allow for this level of housing development to occur. Not that it's actually going to be constructed, since in order to construct it, a developer has to come in and say they're going to construct the housing. Item 4 is participate in an ongoing cooperative multi-jurisdictional planning process. And I think this is probably one of the more important elements of Measure J. And you know, the way I look at this one is the cities didn't all used to be friends when it came time to talk about new developments, and there were no regional transportation planning committees. There were no regular meetings among the cities in each sub-area, and it was really much more haphazard. There were fewer rules and little incentive for cities to plan together. So the analogy I would use is it's like a river, and the folks upstream are doing something to the river that the folks downstream don't like, whatever analogy you want to use. And also, maybe the folks downstream are damming up the river, so it's backing up and flooding the communities upstream. But traffic is very similar. If you have developers coming in upstream, building new houses that generate new vehicular trips, and the downstream jurisdictions have to receive that traffic. So the growth management program got to the heart of this. It said the responsible parties have to get together and in advance agree on performance measures, agree on multimodal transportation service objectives, and those are locked into their what we call the action plans for regional routes, and they're incorporated into the countywide plan. And so then when a new development comes along, what is the impact of that new development on the downstream communities based upon those pre-established objectives? And that's the whole general plan amendment review process, the action plans, and there's a lot to that that I'd be happy to sit down with you and explain in great detail, individually, not today. So that's cooperative planning. The 5th one is adopt a voter-approved urban limit line. In 2004, when the voters approved Measure J, the county had its urban limit line, but the cities did not. And at the time, we thought that we'd be able to develop a countywide, mutually agreed upon urban limit line. That did not happen, so we ended up having each city either develop their own urban limit line and have their voters vote on it, or a city could adopt the county's urban limit line. And this is kind of the shift that we saw in Measure J, going from C to J, a shift from looking strictly at vehicle trips and traffic mitigation over to land use preservation, and drawing a line of defining where development could and could not occur. And so most of the cities use the county's urban limit line. Antioch, Pittsburgh, and San Ramon have their own. I think Brentwood made an attempt for an urban limit line measure, but it was defeated. And so all the other cities adopted the county's ULL, which, by the way, passed by a majority of the voters in every jurisdiction in Contra Costa. So 2 more. One is, number 6 is develop a 5-year capital improvement program. This one is kind of a mundane thing and kind of a throwback to Measure C, which had performance measures for public services. Measure C included performance measures for fire, police, parks, sanitary, flood, and water. And the CIP is supposed to show that the jurisdictions can build those facilities, that they have funds to do it, and that they can meet their performance measures. And in most jurisdictions, those performance measures still reside in the city's general plan and in their growth management element. They have not been withdrawn. And finally, 7 is adopt a transportation systems management ordinance or resolution. So the choices are, you can take your Measure C funds and build projects. You can increase the supply of transportation, but we can also attempt to reduce demand and improve efficiency. And so this is, again, invoking that multifaceted approach, try to reduce demand and improve efficiency, through this ordinance or resolution. It was actually initially an ordinance, and there was a mandatory employer-based reduction program that was later prohibited by state legislation, and so now it's essentially a commitment by local jurisdictions to look at ways to reduce single-occupant vehicles, encourage carpooling, and transit usage. So that's the growth management program. The checklist, as I said, it goes out every 2 years. Jurisdictions have a year and a half to submit their checklists. They report on the previous 2 years' activities. We have a standing committee, our Citizens Advisory Committee, which they review the checklists. They're essentially our watchdog on growth management, and they make recommendations to our planning committee and the authority about whether or not they think the jurisdiction is in compliance and should receive its local street funds and be eligible for transportation for livable communities. And if the jurisdiction is non-compliant, then funds would be are withheld on a go-forward basis. And that's one of the questions that that comes up often. Well, has anybody ever been out of compliance with this thing? And in fact, many jurisdictions have. But as a staff person at CCTA, what I do is we work behind the scenes with the local jurisdictions. So if we see on the checklist that they haven't met their performance measures, for example, there's been jurisdictions that couldn't meet their police or fire or sheriff's facilities requirements. There have been jurisdictions that did not complete their housing element, that it wasn't in compliance with state law. Issues with maintenance of effort on our local street maintenance. I didn't mention maintenance of effort, but jurisdictions have to maintain a certain level of expenditures from their general plan. There have been issues with that. Participation in the Regional Transportation Mitigation Program. We had a long discussion with one jurisdiction about that one. And probably the biggest issue that we've had to address is when a jurisdiction just takes unilateral action to develop a project, construct a project, approve a project that has not been sufficiently vetted with the downstream jurisdictions. But there are many success stories. You know, I think at first we had kind of a Tower of Babel when it came time to talk about a project. How big is the project? How many trips does it generate? How do you measure the impacts of those trips? How do you decide how many take transit? We've developed a uniform set of procedures to have everyone speak the same language. So when we come to the table, this upstream, downstream issue doesn't get hung up on, you know, how much water are we talking about you pouring into our communities. And certainly in every corridor there's been a success story where the local jurisdictions have gotten together all the way up and down the San Pablo corridor in West County. If you look at the Railroad Avenue, Kirker Pass, Ignacio Valley Road corridor, Pittsburgh and the cities of Walnut Creek and Concord have all gotten together to talk about how that traffic will be brought into Central County from East County and coordinated with the Route 4 widening project. The I-80 Integrated Corridor Management Program is a success story, I think. And our program actually goes into the Tri-Valley, so the issue of East County and the Tri-Valley and the use of Vasco Road is addressed through our growth management program, implementing what they call in the Tri-Valley plan a thing called gateway constraints, which actually limits Vasco Road down to 2 lanes, 1 lane in each direction. So that, in a nutshell, is the program, and I thank you for your patience, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions for Martin before we go on to a discussion of items that you would like to see considered? Mike.
So I guess continuing to harp on the housing production theme, how would you say that the jurisdictions have done at meeting requirement number 3 to address housing options, which seems to have as its goal fulfilling RENA obligations, but then there's a couple other ways to pass that test. I haven't looked I haven't looked lately at the exact numbers. My sense is jurisdictions in Contra Costa County have done a lot better than in other counties, but are still fairly far ways from meeting their arena numbers. Is it the sense of the of CCTA in interpreting compliance with the growth management plan that that's working well, or that we're still kind of lagging in meeting the goal to address housing options?
So for each jurisdiction, every year they generate a report on how many units they've approved, and how many units have gone to construction, how many permits have been released, and how many units have been occupied. And what we see is that the thing is totally driven by the economy. So while the jurisdiction may be in compliance with state law and in compliance with our growth management program in that they've zoned for the RENA numbers, we might not see the production. I just got a report from a city in West County where the production for the past year was 0, and no new houses were constructed. When we review the reports, generally what I've seen is most of the jurisdictions are able to produce market rate housing, but they usually fall short in the low income and very low income category.
Other questions? Yeah, Debbie. Yes, you do. You don't need it for us to hear you, but you need it to be taped so we have a record of the meeting.
So we can hold it against you in the future. So I was curious if you could go a little bit more into how the standards were developed, whether or not they're, the SMART goals, whether they're measurable, achievable, all that fun stuff, because it sounds to me like if they're not meeting it, the funds are withheld, but the funds aren't being withheld. So you're just working behind the scenes with them to work around what the requirements were. I'm just curious how that dynamic works. And, well, let's hit that one first.
So regarding the overall objectives for the highway network, is that what you're talking about? For
Well,
arterial streets and freeways?
So
Those standards are agreed to in what we call these action plans for routes of regional significance. They're objectives and they're set. And we test them when we develop the countywide plan. We test them for the year 2040 now for this current plan. And we say, given everybody's general plan, can these objectives be achieved? And the plan is developed so that they can. And then the question is, if there's a big general plan amendment, what does that do to the sub-area's ability to meet these objectives? And if it rocks the boat on the objectives, that's where the discussions begin. And what we're looking for really is successful discussions and good faith discussions. But it's up to the sub-area, the regional committee, to decide whether or not they think that this proposed general plan amendment will adversely affect the transportation system. And so it's all done through the cooperative planning process. I think it was a little a stronger line, a bright line test back in the Measure C days when it simply said, you have to have so many acres of park per citizen or per 1,000 citizens. Then it was very easy, of course, to say, well, you haven't met your service standard. And that's really not happening anymore since Measure J kicked in and we dropped those service standards.
Okay, I don't want to spend a bunch of time on it because I'm sure everybody's a lot more educated around this than I am. It just seems like some of it is not really enforceable, or there's not a lot of, to me at least, clarity about what's happening and whether or not, especially as we're talking about housing being this huge issue, how much that is incorporated into the housing element, talks to the transportation plan, talks to what actually happens in reality with state funding streams and things like that. So for me, I will actually request a meeting with you offline just to get a little education around this so that I don't delay the group.
Great, thank you. Other questions for Martin? Lisa, and then Seth, and then Joel.
Martin, has CCTA ever undertaken a comprehensive analysis of the growth management plan as a whole, and whether or not you have a lot of anecdotal examples of what are viewed as successes, but has it achieved, has the growth management plan, where are its strong points, where are points, there's been a suggestion that it should be strengthened, are there places that it has come up short? Kind of a big picture look at how the growth management plan has worked or not worked, and in what combination thereof.
I think the last time we really did that in a thorough fashion was running up to the 2004 Measure J, and that's when we really, looked at each element very carefully, and that's when we made the shift from these service standards to the ULL, and that's when we assessed each item and decided whether to keep it, whether to strengthen it, whether to leave it as it is. And since then, that might be a good idea for this effort, is to go through it again, at that level. Maybe that's what's required. But we don't have a regular overall assessment or report card. It might be a good idea to do that, though.
Let's see, Seth was next.
One sort of dramatic change that's happened since the growth management plan was strengthened the last time. It's still very rudimentary if you consider other growth. It's still rudimentary compared to other growth management initiatives, things like that. It's, as you see, it's pretty brief and has some areas that are unclear. But I want to ask you a question, Martin, then sort of do a follow-up, which is, what was the CCTA's experience once greenhouse gas laws started being passed in terms of the county's achievement of those goals relative to the growth management plan?
So our achievement of those goals, our achievement of SB 375, of AB 32, SB 375, is driven by two things. One is it's driven by the Sustainable Community Strategy that MTC adopted in 2013, and that is reflected in the land use that we've adopted. We have a land use program, a land use forecast that is driven by the Sustainable Community Strategy, and then all of the assumptions about PAVLI 1 and 2 and the reductions in vehicle emissions and alternative fuels and improve vehicle efficiency. Those also help us meet the requirements of SB 375. So we're following MTC in that regard, and those analyses are done at a regional level. And MTC hasn't told us, well, Solano's out and Marin's in or anything like that. We don't really know at the county level whether there's one county that's misbehaving and another county that's making up for it. So it's an entire regional analysis of whether the goal of a 15% reduction by 2035 was met. And so we think we meet that goal through reflection of the Sustainable Community Strategy in our plans.
So the follow-up is that the growth management the growth management plan as a part of a transportation measure. I think we were the first county in California to link those two things, and it put us in better shape to achieve the greenhouse gas goals once they were passed, and so we didn't have as big a lift as some of the counties did. But of course, we have to continue meeting increasing goals. So one of the thoughts we have is we certainly have some ideas about ways in which to improve the growth management plan. But what we would really like to see are some best practices for each of the elements that are discussed there of what's the current thinking on how to accomplish some of these goals in an enhanced growth management plan. And while we have some ideas, we'd like staff in some way to do that kind of review and come up with some proposals that we can look at as potential options.
Yeah, well, let's hold that kind of comment until we get to the next item on our agenda, 2.1.2. We can come back to that. The next speaker is, I want to focus right now on just questions for Martin, and Joel would be the next speaker. Okay, are there any questions now still for Martin before we move on? Okay, Sean and then Bob.
Thank you, Martin. The real I see some teeth in this program and a few elements, but one that caught my eye was the mitigation program, and that each region develops their own mitigation program. Now, I'm just trying to get an idea for what's on the table for enhancement in this measure extension, and particularly with this element, part of how we've been successful in getting non-motorized transportation, bike ped trails, is working with developers, have them construct them as mitigation. I'm wondering if that's included in anybody else, in any region's plans, if there's ways we can put details into that.
So the regional mitigation program focuses on primarily constructing mitigations. It can involve programs. It can involve shuttle buses. I mean, in Central County, the mitigation program is driven from what we call the Oakhurst model, where there was a development in Oakhurst, and the developer, as a mitigation for the traffic that was going to be sent down Clayton Road and down Ignacio Valley Road into Walnut Creek, funded the downtown Walnut Creek free shuttle. So there are all kinds of ways for the mitigation to take place. It's not necessarily the widening of streets, and it's certainly not the construction of triple left turns. I think the reason that we shifted really from performance measures to the ULL was that in many respects developers were saying, okay, if we have to build a triple left turn, we'll build it, we'll pay for it. And that triple left turn lane didn't always suit the character of the downstream jurisdiction. So it's really, it's a back and forth discussion, and it's not, we'll build you a soccer field. It's got to be transportation oriented, but it can be, it certainly is multimodal. It certainly can involve pedestrian bridges and bicycle mitigations. It can involve punch-throughs for pedestrians. Anything that will help reduce the impacts on the downstream community. That's what these regional committees get together and talk about, and that's really the negotiation. And we're looking for consensus that everybody's happy in the end, not so much, what was the actual mitigation. We don't look at the actual mitigation and test it per se, but we want to make sure that there was consultation and that the downstream community is satisfied with the mitigation.
Bob?
Thank you. I've got four questions on 4 of the items, which for me, 4 out of 7 is not too bad. The number one, you mentioned growth management, and it seems like the discussion is focusing on housing for some pretty apparent reasons, but I'd like to hear, from what I've seen, housing is not the only answer. There needs to, for some economic reasons, you should explore commercial and maybe industrial expansion and so forth. And has there been any discussion of, I would hope that we're not just trying to meet one need with this measure and then perhaps meet another need in another measure. It would be good to have an integrated approach. That's my first question. The second one on the development mitigation program, are you, the developers I've spoken with, every one of them cite the length of time it takes to bring a project out of the ground, as we say, is extraordinarily long. And I'm wondering if this is a way to kind of eliminate some of the unknowns in that, or am I missing the point of that? Number 3, on the housing options, I just want to say you ask a very good question. Who will buy them? And of course, we're very interested to know who will build them, and if they're, and that will address a number of not only environmental issues with lower commute times and so forth, but some economic issues through the income multiplier. And my last comment, it says adopt a transportation system management ordinance or resolution. Is this for maintenance of the transportation system, or is this to maybe address some issues that come up later that perhaps we did not think of today.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the housing and jobs question. And in your packet, it says the program is to address housing options. Originally, the program was to address housing options and job opportunities, and there was a real push to get jobs located in places so that we could start a reverse commute, so that there would be less traffic going, in the good old-fashioned directions. And we're of course looking for an integrated land use program, and I think the development mitigation program talks to that or speaks to that a little more about balancing jobs and housing, and certainly the ongoing cooperative multi-jurisdictional planning process talks about a mix of land use that will help to mitigate the impacts created by the new development. But we're primarily focused on the housing element of the local jurisdictions and what it says and how it's zoned and whether it provides opportunities for the housing to come in and be constructed. But we don't actually look at whether or not it gets built. That's kind of up to the economy. And I think similarly with jobs, as I recall, we did get some pushback from the local jurisdictions. They can't control commercial development job. Where do jobs go? They might have a huge parcel zone for commercial, but if nobody comes in, nobody comes in, and the jobs don't come.
Yes, I certainly understand that. I certainly understand that. I mean, if there's no restaurant there, it's difficult to get people to eat at the restaurant. I mean, it would. As far as the development mitigation program, so there's no streamline. I don't want to make an ask here, but is part of that a streamlining process, of the process?
Well, the development mitigation program in most of the local jurisdictions, it involves going to the permit desk, and when the permit's pulled, the fee is charged at that point. And it's a fixed fee based upon number of units or number of square foot of development, commercial or retail. So I don't think that's an impediment to the process. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Did you get your questions answered, Bob? I am getting concerned about time. My goal of 2 o'clock is way past, and I'm now concerned we're going to start at 3 o'clock with item 2.2. Bob, are you satisfied with the answers?
Yes,
Great. Okay.
I am. What the management, systems management, the systems management, does that refer to maintenance of the system, or does that take into account some future?
So transportation systems management resolution or ordinance is essentially, it's an ordinance or resolution adopted by the city which commits to implementing a transportation reduction program through its general plan review process, through its building permit approval process. And it may be as simple as requiring that in every new home there is a folder put on the kitchen counter that says, here's where your BART station is, here's where your bus lines are, here's how you can carpool, and it's a mitigation program that tries to reduce trips.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any final questions for Martin? All right, we do want to take public comment. I actually was reminded that I forgot to take public comment on item 1 on our agenda. So at this point, I want to open it up to the floor, to the public, for any comments on any part of agenda item 1 or this first part of agenda item 2 regarding policies. We'll take public comment on 2.2 in a few minutes. But any public comment on item 1 or item 2.1? Okay, hearing none. Then we will go on to item 2.1.2, which is that, hello? Is that okay?
I thought that we were having discussion after questions.
Well, that discussion is really the next item. So the next item is a discussion of what items you would like to see covered in the growth management plan regarding growth management and policy. as this process moves forward. We're not going to try and resolve those issues today, but we are going to try and list them. So I'm going to actually stand at the easel and write, and some of you may feel that the growth management program or other policies should be kept as they are. Some of you may have ideas as to how they should be changed. We want to daylight that entire range of thoughts, and to the extent there's any consensus, we'll note that. To the extent that they're just independent ideas, we'll note them as things that we need to agendize for future meetings on the 28th and into October. So, does that answer your concern, Joel? Yeah. Good. All right. So, who wants to begin with a comment in this regard?
I'll start.
Lisa, please.
I would support the status quo of the growth management plan. And in the event that changes to that are considered that would strengthen that growth management plan, we would ask that there be an analysis of the baseline, so to speak. You know, what has the current plan accomplished? Where does the analysis show that it has fallen short? In other words, is there a reason to change it other than it just sounds good to change it? And certainly the public supports growth management, but when you get down to it, it also means that those things could be barriers to housing production inside the urban limit line, inside places that we want to have housing, and we would like to make sure that that does not happen.
I can take the next person. I can't see.
Sean, you want to go? No, I'll go after you. On? Yes. Whoa. Well, I won't speak in exact response to those comments, but just my brief kind of preface, which was going to be my comments before, is that I appreciate the presentation today. We had requested at the last EPAC. I really appreciate Martin for your taking careful consideration of that presentation. And Contra Costa and CCTA have obviously been leaders for 25 years. But to answer some of the comments, we are falling way behind. Since the 1990s, Contra Costa has lost 20% of its ag land to sprawl. So in the heat of the last boom, we undermined our ability to provide agriculture and to preserve what we have and continue our economy in that regard. Contra Costa County has the most amount of at-risk acres, high-risk acres, in the entire 9-county Bay Area region, which is 18,000 acres, or the equivalent of 18 Golden Gate parks. Despite the fact that we now have an unprecedented amount of congestion in our county, and there's an incredible amount of pressure from our cities to grow, sprawl developers in particular continue to put pressure on areas that are easy, I could say, which are the ag and open spaces, rather than prioritize and fight for infill development near transit, which is really the hard battle. But one that would have backing from just about everybody. And so, to back that up with Plan Bay Area, we now have a regional vision for 30 years that says we can do it within our urban limit lines, and that's great, but it needs some real savviness and non-status quo type planning behavior in order to achieve smart growth, reducing congestion, and achieving our quality of life. So some of the things that we'd like to see would be in terms of the strengthening of our urban limit line would be removing the loophole that allows 30-acre exceptions to the urban limit line. That is one of the things that is of significant concern. It was not needed in the last one and shouldn't be in the current measure. I agree that reviewing lands within the urban limit line would be great to see if there are things that can be actually tightened in the urban limit line, areas of significant agricultural and open space value that have either been targeted with priority conservation areas or other things. So I think there are areas where we can tighten. And let's see here. We're staying just on the growth management component. Okay, great. Do advanced mitigation. So we've talked about that before, and we'll come back to that again, I think, in future conversations, but just to note that now. We want to see stronger growth management performance measures. So something that you can even just put OBAG on there. OBAG-like program that would incentivize infill development and reward jurisdictions that are doing transit-oriented development for all incomes. And specifically remove projects that would undermine the ability to do any of these types of activities and would undermine the urban limit line, which include the James Donlan extension, the Camino Tazahara extension and widening, and SR 239.
I'll go ahead and it's just second the advanced mitigation part of what Joel just referred to, in that it seems like there's a fee collected, there's a negotiation that happens, there's this long drawn out process. It's sort of different every time. I'm sure it's not exactly how I'm presenting it. It sounds like it's been effective. But as far as Bob's comments about streamlining the process, the easier it is, the more support I think the program is going to get, the more effective it'll be.
Other comments, items that should be listed for possible future discussion?
I've got a few.
Seth and then Mike.
Oh, please, Mike.
Mike and then Seth.
Stereo. Well, I think I've said this before, but just for sake of getting a note up there, that one strategy for keeping development pressures off of the lands where we don't want development is to ensure that we can accommodate the necessary development and that it actually happens where we do want it. So for the list, for future discussion, strengthening the incentives, the mandates, the carrots and sticks for local approval, local zoning, locally provided incentives. You know, many people here know the levers better than I do, but to encourage development where we do want it.
Yeah, we provided staff with a white paper where Safe Mount Diablo sort of analyzed some of these issues, and we'd like them to distribute it with the next board packet by email in some way, so that you can see some. These aren't positions we're taking. These are just some conversations we wanted to get started, and part of that was about strengthening the urban limit line. And I appreciate Joel's suggestions. For example, the 30-acre adjustment to the urban limit line was put there with the idea of what things might jurisdictions want. It's only been used once since Measure J was passed, or is being used once since Measure J was passed. And frankly, we think the value of the urban limit lines is really substantial, and if you want to change it, take it to a vote of the people. And similarly, the question about the discussion of reviews, the growth management program is really great, but it also has some problems with things that aren't clear. So relative to supporting the status quo, part of the status quo is a lack of clarity on some things, like there's supposed to be 5- and 10-year reviews, but it doesn't say who's supposed to do them. Is it CCTA? Is it the county? We think if anybody wants to do a review, great. And if you're going to do it, then maybe say that CCTA should fund it. But it shouldn't change the fact that whatever it shows is good information for a campaign, but if you want to change an urban limit line, you have to go to a vote of the people, as the current measure says. Some of those clarifications are, it refers to urban development, but it doesn't say what urban is. And there are various definitions used for housing and other things that the state and the feds use for urban. So those are some of the just sort of definitional clarifications. A significant thing that's missing is the way in which you get compliance if it's an urban service relative to a special district, because they don't get funding from CCTA, I don't believe in general, for a return to source, the 18% or the 5%. There's no carrot to incentivize how they deal with the urban limit line. Some of them are recognizing it and respecting it, some of them aren't. So how this works relative to special districts, there could be some additions to strengthen the plan through that. Bob Lilly mentioned the idea of, this just refers to housing, and I want to say that we're as interested in ways to direct and manage growth relative to protecting open space and agricultural lands as we are in ways to make some things more streamlined and easier, such as the production of housing, affordable housing, et cetera. And so some of the things could be incentivized to make communities who wouldn't normally be interested in allowing some of that kind of development to take a better advantage of that carrot. A really cogent example is communities where staff and decision makers sometimes want to, for example, in the northern waterfront area, encourage high quality jobs through industrial and light industrial applications, and then you have a developer come in, ask for a rezoning to residential, and not only does it lose that rare parcel that's zoned for industrial or light industrial, but it affects the other, having a residential area surrounded by industrial or light industrial creates an instant source of conflict between those new residential users and those potential high quality jobs. So putting in some things that make it harder to affect industrial lands, for example, or that make the process more transparent could be really useful. The bottom line is there are all kinds of ways in which you can manage growth, and we have a few ideas. We don't have any kind of expertise on what the best transportation related ideas are, but there's a guy named Robert Liberty who's a professor and former elected official in the Portland Metro up at Portland State University, who's done an analysis of growth management measures, especially urban growth boundaries, throughout the entire country, and that staff could look at a laundry list of possible ways of strengthening growth management, which could make our program even more effective.
And just in terms of your own white paper, Ross, can you confirm, do we have that electronically already?
We passed it on to Eric and Doug last week. They had a.
We can scan it.
Right.
We'll scan it. Okay, so we'll scan it, turn it into a PDF, and distribute it to the community. Okay.
And I can give a copy to whomever.
Yeah, I mean, we do have definitely a paper copy, but if we had it electronically, it would be easier to send out. But if you want us to scan it and send it, we'll do that.
We're happy to do that. I think we have, but.
Yeah, just a question of clarification. I'm going to withhold support or opposition to anything that we've heard today, and you said that we're going to table these points for the future discussion.
That's right.
I'm just curious when that discussion is going to happen.
We have to look at agenda, and we have to consider where we get today, but I'm picturing that we'll do them incrementally over the next 3 meetings.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. What I don't want any of you to withhold are any other ideas. I'm hoping that today we're getting a complete list of all the items that should be considered. And we certainly heard, I think it was from Lisa, that maybe things are good as they are. And some of you may also feel that. But where I'm headed with this is that we will take each of these points, which I think are actually only 6 or 7 so far.
Except I want to really disagree with that, because none of us is an expert on growth management. We have little bits of expertise, and that's why I suggested a process relative to staff examination of how we could come up with an actual list of options that could be useful. There are a few things relative to this very brief growth management plan that we have now, but there are definitely a lot better, and some things like the definition of urban, things like that. I'm really looking for some staff work on this item, and/or some of the reviews that Lisa was suggesting.
Yeah, and to clarify, I'm not suggesting that the current growth management plan is perfect, or that we should, or that all components of it are terrific. Just that if we're going to change it, we need to make sure what we're changing. And I don't think we know. I don't think we know necessarily what we have and what the impacts would be of changing. I want to make sure we look at those.
Anyone who hasn't spoken? Just want to quickly second what Seth said about Robert Liberty. We've actually already reached out to him. We were told by CCTA staff, by Ross, that this meeting was about what's happened before and some discussion about what's going forward, but it would be great to have a visionary who has worked across the country, and so we've already established that connection, and hopefully we can make that work. Just want to point that out.
Okay, well,
Yeah, yeah, certainly. Yeah, we're gonna need some additional guidance on the kinds of options. You know, if Mr. Liberty or Professor Liberty can give us some specific points, that's fine. To get some broad literature search and identify options out here, I'm not sure we have the time or bandwidth to do that. Yeah. So we can, you know, if you could help set it up, we can certainly do some outreach to named individuals, but to get into an exhaustive.
Well, he already did the exhaustive report, and he's got a summary of it that you can find online.
Yeah, okay, that's not necessarily what I heard. So if that's what we're talking about, we can certainly look at that.
Yeah, I will say, and I'm worried a little bit, I'm coming out of my facilitator role here, but I'll say this anyway. I had understood this group, all of you, as coming from a variety of points of view within the county, and that you all would be providing to each other the ideas that you want to have considered. And I'm a little concerned to put, I mean, my firm, just so you know, I mean, we do growth management planning for other jurisdictions when we're asked to do that. I am honestly something of an expert on the subject. That said, I didn't see it as my role or staff's or consultants' role to tell all of you what the options are that you should be considering. I had thought in this particular case, EPAC members were going to be discussing with each other the ideas that you were hoping to have considered and to weigh their pros and cons. So it is a different assignment than the one that I had thought that staff and consultant had. If you're now asking that the staff and consultant team bring you either a list of, I mean, you know, there are probably 50 different ways to approach growth management. I don't know that all of you as a team have time to consider all 50 of them in a joint session. And so I had thought that each of you would be doing this research on your own, working from your own experience, and bringing forward the list that we are starting to make here today as to the things you want to have considered. So now I'm hearing a request that maybe we should make a laundry list and that you then would look at that laundry list and discuss them. I had not understood that until this time. Let's let Kristen go.
Just to jump in here, and Seth, if I'm backing you up in the wrong way, let me know. I think we might have spent more time being worried about expanding the scope than it would actually take to like download a report and include it and confer with this professor to talk. I mean, I don't think that Seth is suggesting an exhaustive national search or anything, a super deep dive, in the sense that this is there's a shortcut by using this person's research and we can take it for what it is. But I think it's good to be aspirational about best practices. Again, we don't want to boil the ocean or get off track or miss our deadlines. But I think that it's, you know, I think that to try and meet these goals and make it easier to build things where they need to be built and to, you know, protect what should be protected and, you know, realize the vision. Exactly,
Right.
exactly. Make it
Well,
easier
so
where
can
it
I
should be
suggest,
built.
and maybe this can jumpstart or today's discussion. We try and finish up a list here. We understand it to be preliminary and incomplete. We get to you as quickly as possible Professor Liberty's paper, which apparently already exists, and that you all look at that and come prepared to finish this discussion at the meeting on the 28th. And then we will have the 2 meetings in October whatever gets onto the list on the 28th will then be a final list. And then we'll use the 2 meetings in October, or parts of each of those meetings, to go through that list and talk about the pros and cons of whichever things are on the list.
I'd like to add to that too, that some discussion or presentation of how this mitigation, how the growth management plan is performing now and how it was derived in 2004. Just some more information on the current plan.
How would that be different from the presentation you just got from Martin? It was our intention that that be what Martin just told you.
And I understand that that was the intention. I guess if I'm the only one sitting here that doesn't know how well it's doing, if we've met the goals or not, then strike my comments. But I guess I just don't have an idea for how well we're doing comparatively in growth management.
And I want to just back up to why we were in support of growth management in the first place, which was, I mean, we're in support of it for all kinds of reasons to protect open space. But when it came down to transportation, the county residents were being asked to support a sales tax measure representing billions of dollars. And the real question was, will this make things better? And so the idea was, you have a growth management program so that you're actually making sure that transportation is going to make things better rather than just continuing sprawling out, serving additional not easily sustainable transportation system. We call it the fat man loosening his belt in terms of just doing more of the same. And for me, the growth management program is the most important part of this. For others, it's the big buckets of funding. But if we're going to make this a transformational plan, which is really going to address greenhouse gas emission reductions, vehicle mile travel reductions, things like that, the growth management plan is really at the heart, along with funding the right projects and not funding the wrong ones. It's at the heart of how to choose better outcomes.
All right, so I need to take a minute just to figure out exactly who wants to speak next, but let me say where I think we are. I think what we're then saying is that maybe at the next meeting, Martin, is this a request from the whole committee for a further report from Martin on effectiveness? I think that's what Sean's asking for. Sean, is that a fair summary in one word? Are you looking for a further assessment of the effectiveness of the program?
Well, I guess it would have just been like another 5 minutes of Martin probably describing the plan. We had a great overview of what are the 7 elements. But it's not clear to me that how that's working on the ground.
Are there perhaps some pages from an annual report that we might be able to look at, to something that you could email around?
Martin, do you have something, can you even comment on this right now, and we could then put this particular item aside? I'm just trying to help us move along. Well, what has been the effectiveness of the program?
I think the program is extremely effective, without question. But I think, just to get to the point here of what you want to talk about on the 28th, we could put together a matrix for you that has these 7 elements and talks about, whether they should be strengthened or loosened and what the implications are. And then if there are new elements that you think should be introduced by this Liberty paper or whatever it is, we could list those. But I think certainly just to start with, Seth has talked about the ULL, and we could say here it is, and what would be involved with loosening it, what's the status quo, and what would it be involved with strengthening it. In this case, you've suggested the 30-acre provision be reduced or eliminated. And so maybe that's a way to kind of get to what you're trying to do here. Your work here is to tell us whether you think the growth management program should be amended or whether carried on exactly as it is, or whether this new measure should be separate from it. And really, I mean, to get to that, you could look at what we have, and we could give you options, and you could discuss those.
Okay. So in terms of just the question of effectiveness, maybe was that then enough answer there?
I feel it is.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So we'll put that aside, and then so I think what we'll do in addition, what I'd like to suggest is that we will distribute both the white paper from Save Mount Diablo, as well as, if we can, particularly if someone can help us to get a link to it, the summary report by Professor Liberty. Those will come out to you all in short order. Martin, I'm going to suggest that rather than we trying to go through the 7 items, what I'd like to do is just write this up more in a bullet list of the items we've heard today and attach that to the 2 papers we've just talked about, the Save Mount Diablo paper and the Liberty paper, and that then we ask all of you to come back on the 28th prepared to augment the list that you've already started here with the features that you've seen from Professor Liberty in the Save Mount Diablo paper or in any other research you all may do, and come ready to finish up a list of items to be considered. We'll then put them on an agenda for the 2 meetings in October, October 12th and 26th, at which we'll go through those point by point. You can have discussions about their pros and cons and then decide which, if any of those, you'd like to include in the measure.
Yeah.
Is that a workable approach here?
If I could just add one comment regarding the performance, I have to remind everybody, and maybe I was remiss in my presentation, the growth management program does not control land use decisions. Local jurisdictions maintain complete sovereignty over their land use decisions, and also the growth management program does not control the economy, and the economy has a huge impact on traffic and traffic congestion and housing starts and all that. So that's the issue with, if you want to talk about performance, are we overriding local land use decisions? No, we're not allowed to. And are we controlling the economy? No, we can't. So that's why I think we should just get to the 7 items and work with those.
Yeah, Seth.
I agree entirely with what Martin just said, but as he also said at the beginning, these are incentives. These are 18% return to source funds for local streets maintenance, et cetera, and 5% TLC funds, which are especially designed to look at basically a sustainable community strategies type things. That's a pot of money that if you comply with these voluntary measures, you can qualify for those sources of funds. So even though CCTA is not a land use planning agency, it's a transportation agency, it is a pretty significant carrot for people who want to qualify for those sources of funds. And so there's a lot of leeway in what you can ask for people who want to qualify for those funds.
All right, so have we got an approach for next time, moving forward? All right, well, I've missed my goal by an hour and a quarter. It's 3:15 instead of 2 o'clock. But we are at a point, and I hope we can move forward without a break, we are at a point where we can now discuss, move on to the Transportation Enhancement Plan itself. Excuse me? We did public comment on this item. Yeah. We have done public comment on both items 1 and 2.1 now. We're going to move into 2.2, and my proposal would be that we talk for about 20 minutes, then take public comment on that item if there is any, and then wrap up with about another 20 minutes of comment. I'm at 2 microphones now. I'm double mic'd. I think this one goes way down there. Is this on? We are beginning this item with the last 2 pages of your packet, which have on them just an overview, and then the very final page is a table that shows in a summary form 3. We get confused. They're not even properly called alternatives nor proposals. You might call them packages.
I don't think your mic's on.
I sort of don't think so either. The light's on.
Oh, you're just not talking.
I'm just not. How's that? If blah, blah, blah. So there are 3 packages of approaches to allocating transportation sales tax dollars on this final page of your packet. And I mentioned at the outset what those were, and I'll say again. The first of these tables simply shows how funds were allocated under Measure J as it exists today. This is not an extension of that sales tax. This is an augmentation of that sales tax, which would run at the same time. So there is no reason that there has to be the same allocation under the new measure as there was or is under Measure J, but this is here for your reference to give a sense of what Measure J did in the past. Next to that, in the middle column, is the proposal submitted by Public Advocates, Inc. On behalf of several advocacy organizations. They have entitled it an equity and climate scenario. It is, I might add, very similar to option C that's being reviewed under the draft EIR. And then we have also here an amalgamation of the 4 proposals submitted by the 4 RTPCs, that if you simply add up the numbers from each of the 4 RTPCs and look at them as percentages of the entire $2.3 billion, this 3rd column is what you would get in that regard. We have today also given you the 3 options being analyzed in the EIR. All of those have dollar values that are 3 times as high as those in the TEP because of leveraging, but those provide other perhaps starting points for discussion. Option C, as I mentioned a minute ago, is very similar to the Public Advocates proposal, but there are 2 additional ones. Options A and B are both there, and those are 2 more starting points for discussion. What I would like to do today, similar to what we just did for the discussion about policy issues, is allow all of you to get a read of your own thoughts, of each other's thoughts, about what a good starting point or a good landing point might be regarding an expenditure plan, looking at these 5 or 6, 3, 5 or 6 options as starting points. Where do you all think the discussion should head? What do you think are the strengths, weaknesses, interesting points about each of these proposals? If we can get a sense of that today through this discussion with some public comment as well, we'll then be in a position, I think, to discuss next steps for the next 3 meetings and figure out how to move this discussion by the end of October or early November to a place where you have a single proposal to move forward to the authority board. So with that stated, I'd like to open it up for your discussion as to what your thoughts are about these options. Please.
So I wanted to comment on the previous one, just simply to say, if we have an opportunity in this process moving forward where we're discussing a subject like growth management, it is helpful for me, and I'll speak for myself, but I can't imagine that everybody in this room is an expert on growth management, that we do have what best practices are having presented to us as a group so that we at least have that as a launching point, because it's a little bit frustrating to have a conversation about something. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not whatever other people are in the room. So having that moving forward on any topical discussion would be helpful for me. I don't have the time to do the research, and so I'm not going to say who should be doing it, but I think you're convening a group of very wide, diverse group of people with different backgrounds. It would be helpful for us to have some best practices that are happening in the United States on any given topic. That would be my first comment. My second comment is, I look at these and I want to just ask the question. So when you give us the RTPC recommendations, the RTPCs are comprised of one engineer from each city in each region. What is the composition of that? What is the background of that? I think that information is helpful for us to understand, because this group of people is a group of stakeholders from various different points of service or perspectives, and it's very different than what you're seeing in an RTPC. So having that sort of background too, where did this come from, what's the perspective, is also helpful in guiding, I think.
Okay, I can try to address some of that. So generally speaking, the RTPCs are made up of the county and then the jurisdictions that are in each area. In West County, transit properties are also members, voting members on the RTPCs. So this process that resulted in this proposal here, I think we could say was a pretty much bottoms-up process through their technical advisory committees. So that is a combination of public works folks and planners, so it's both the engineers and planners. We did ask that other interests of other public agencies in the areas where the transit is not a member, that they make an ask or a proposal through the RTPCs as well as BART. So we tried to funnel pretty much all the public entities through the RTPCs. But it was distilled primarily by the tax, with whatever influence that has, and then they were adopted by their policy body, which is a member of each city has one member. And generally speaking, there's in West County a little exception, but generally speaking, the policy body has one supervisor and one member from the council of each of the jurisdictions. So it's at multiple levels to get up here. From a practical point of view, generally, the policy bodies accepted what the technical advisory committee recommended.
But I think that said, in my mind, it's important to understand that officially, the 4 recommendations from the RTPCs are being made by the RTPCs themselves, who consist of city council members primarily from the constituent cities. So officially, these are the RTPC recommendations are a summary of the recommendations made by 4 groups of city council members, each of which is one city council member from each city that is a member of the RTPC. So these are city council members' recommendations.
No, I got that. I was more getting at the fact that it was public works and planners that were coming up with the recommendations that were then going to the city council. So what the lens was that started it, that was my question. Thank you.
All right, Dave.
Yeah, speaking on behalf of Bike East Bay, we definitely want to see 5% for bike ped specific projects, and are encouraged that a lot of the RTPCs are supporting more money for bike ped projects. But even more than that, the most important category for us is a complete streets category. And these are funds that would be used for lots of things to give people choices to get out of their car, or at least get out of their single occupancy car and get to work or school in a better way. And the Complete Streets program funding can come from a number of sources. It could come from the Transportation for Livable Communities source. It could come from local streets and roads, which is probably the #1 candidate. And or it can come from the major streets, traffic flow, traffic smoothing category as well. And we'd like to see 15% for a Complete Streets program. And let me just give one example so that people understand what we're talking about. If you can picture Treat Boulevard right outside of this building here, it's got 8 lanes, and the county, working with Walnut Creek, is trying to make the street more walkable and bikeable. And I'm sure the County Connection would like to time their buses with the BART trains. How are you going to do it? We can't even improve pedestrian crossings and get a bike lane on the street, because to do so would require taking out a lane of traffic. And the traffic engineer says we can't do that. And if we start trying to smooth the traffic flow through this area, we're going to make it harder to do that, not easier to do that. Because the minute you want to slow down that smooth traffic to get a pedestrian safely across the street, or to add a bike lane, or to give buses some priority so that they can make that BART train that we're trying to link them to, that the voters want us to, it's taking capacity from that smooth traffic we just created. And that's why the Complete Streets program is so essential, to make this work for everyone who's using that street out there. And we've got lots of streets like this, these major arterials that run by transit stations. Usually they run by freeways as well, that we want to get more traffic smoothly on and off of. And that's why we can't just smooth traffic. We can't just repave our streets. We need a complete approach. That's why it's essential. I can go on and on and on with examples like this. I can also go on and on with examples of cities that think they're doing this by repaving their streets, and they're not. Thanks.
Okay, other comments about, yes, Lisa.
So specifically, the percentages are a little bit tough to, kind of characterize here, but, in discussions, with our members, they're in huge support, big support for BART. I understand the rolling stock and the capital investment that BART needs is really important. What that ending number ends up being, I think they asked for like pretty much 20 billion, 50 billion, something like that. So probably around 500 million sounds like a good round number, give or take a few dollars. We do have some concerns on the return to source percentage. One of these percentages here is at 30%. I mean, given all the needs that we have and our need to sell this measure to the voters by actually having, distinct projects in here that they can buy into, we would support keeping that percentage at the existing level, which, as I understand, between 18 and 20%. But we would be open to and interested in hearing from others and about an additional percentage points that could be given to cities that actually do something about production of housing in infill areas, in our PDAs, in the places where we want housing inside the urban limit lines, to prove it to be a true incentive, as opposed to just another layer of bureaucracy to get through. And we also, I'm looking at this percentage list, and there's like technology and innovation, 1% on one of them. Gosh, given where we are and what's happening with transportation technology, whether that gets incorporated into other parts of the plan with respect to building infrastructure that supports automated vehicles and demand times and the ramp metering and all of that, I don't know how that gets categorized, but we definitely need to make technology a much bigger piece of this plan, and to sell to the voters, because I think our voters, they need to hear that there's something in this plan that they can actually use and do. It's going to make their lives, as Seth said, better, and not just that it's going to pay for something that somebody else is going to ride, or use, and free up the road for them. So that's kind of a been there, done that philosophy, and so I'd like to see, some recognition of that. Maybe these percentages are not the right place to put that, but those would be my comments.
Great, thank you. I'd love to hear more comments, and particularly any comments that can tie back to any of the 5 or 6 options we've shown you. And Lisa's certainly done that some. Dave's done that in talking about ped bike and complete streets. But just hearing your overall thoughts on how we're going to circle into your preferred approach, working with actual numbers would be great. Joel, and then Kristen.
Yeah, so at some point I'm wondering if we'll talk a little more about the discrepancy or the difference between some of these percentages. You know, the one that jumped out for me, and I'm speaking, I think, mostly on behalf of the 2 members that aren't here, that affordability is important to, and that would be Mary from Genesis and the young lady from ACE. Ms. Fajardo. I know that they were interested particularly in affordability in the bus pass, and if you look in like the other countywide programs section, probably about the 3rd bullet down, you can see a pretty huge discrepancy here between 0.1% in the community focus and 0.1% in economic focus, and then a tremendous, I mean, relatively speaking, 6.5% in the last environmental focus. I suspect that we'll get to a place when we start to break down and figure out how those differences came to be and what they represent, or?
We're at that place now.
Okay.
So,
So
I guess I could interpret your question, Martin. I don't know if you can answer it right now, but I think the question is, what does one get for 0.1% or 1% or 6.5%? What would be the, if you look just those numbers, I think the committee has trouble knowing, well, what do you actually buy in terms of bus passes for those 3 numbers? And I think Peter Engel is going to attempt to answer that question.
Yeah, Peter Engel, I'm the program manager at CCTA. I'll give you a real quick overview of that. So our transportation programs, safety programs for students is basically occurs in 3 of the subregions. And all 3 subregions do things a little bit differently. So in West County, I believe the total percentage is about 0.75%, and that goes to student bus passes for low-income students. And that's basically the eligibility of that is through West Contra Costa Unified School District, and they use students who are in the free and reduced lunch program to determine eligibility. So it really cuts down the means-based administration of that. In Southwest County, they use it to support both of their yellow school bus programs, and they're not traditional home-to-school programs. They're congestion relief programs. So their routing is designed in a way to reduce the most congested intersections around schools. And then in Central County, they use the funds for educational school programs for kids, bicycle safety, pedestrian safety, as well as some small capital programs around the school, sidewalks, striping, signage, things like that. So hopefully that helps.
And
the
so
largest
Peter, would
percent.
it be accurate to say that what you just described is what we're buying with the 4.5%
That's
in
correct.
Measure
And
J now?
the largest percent is the operation of the yellow school bus programs. And I think it's around a little over 2%. And so I think it's 1.5% or so for the Central County program, which is the.
And those items, of course, continue under Measure J for most of the life of this new measure.
That's correct.
So
Those
then,
programs
in
all
addition,
continue.
and I don't know if others in the room can answer this, I know that the public advocates folks who put that package together, they did describe what they were hoping to do with what I believe is an additional 6.5% or 3.3% that they wanted to add under their program. That was obviously for new things, not to continue the things that already exist. And Peter, I don't know if you know or if others know what that 3.3% was intended to do.
I don't know.
Please.
Related to the high schools and middle schools, the bus pass program, I'd like to offer for consideration to this committee, this advisory committee, the fact that wearing my hat with the Contra Costa Community College District, that many of our students are also in need of support for affordable public transportation. We have bus hubs at all 3 of our major colleges, but we also have 2 centers. Transportation is a big issue for our students, and none of the material that I've seen has reflected anything related to the stakeholders that I represent. So I would like to throw that in for consideration as we look at how we prioritize the spending.
Great, thank you. I think we can try and get additional information for next meeting about what program is really supported through each of those dollar values in the new alternatives.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Other,
That was just the first one. I mean, there's all, I imagine we all have the same question about all the items that were.
Sean,
Can I jump in here?
please.
So obviously, we're going to support a measure that has a significant pedestrian, bicycle, and trail component to it. And I believe that it achieves multiple goals. It improves mobility, getting to transit centers, getting to bus stops, etc. It improves accessibility. It improves health and wellness in our community. I think all the reasons that I can list, I think, are important. And if we could find a balance, like if I had to support one of these options, I think it would be option A, but I think the percentage for maintenance of trails and bicycle, pedestrian, and trails should go up. And if we can find a balance with the complete streets funding as well, the whole system connects together, and I believe it. I look at it as a system within a system. And if we're not keeping pace with the amount of money that's going into freeways and BART and all the other modes of transit or transportation, then we're failing to move into the 21st century with what I think if people can move on their own without causing harm to the environment and those around them, I think that's the measure we want to support. And that's it for now.
Thank you. Terry.
Tim was saying, and I also am real familiar with the home to school transportation program that you described, and I know it's been wildly successful at not only reducing vehicular traffic in major arterials within communities, and I would advocate for it being expanded into other communities, not just San Ramon Valley, Tri-Valley, Central County, but also the idea, and thank you for clarifying that these two numbers, percentages reflect what is in addition to that 4.5%, so thank you. So there still seems to be a pretty huge discrepancy between the two numbers, 11 and 3.3, and I would just like to reinforce that the idea of student bus passes not only gets cars off the road, but it also affects things like truancy and chronic absenteeism, which is a huge issue in our county, not just K-12, but also for students attending community colleges.
Great. So we'll take Rita next and then Kristen. And I just really want to underscore the point that Terry just made, because I think that does get confusing, that Measure J will continue to exist through most of the life of the sales tax measure, even if the sales tax measure is adopted. So to the extent that those Measure J dollars are paying for an ongoing program, those ongoing dollars will continue to exist to pay for that ongoing program. Some may say, I don't know exactly where that leads one, but it's important just to understand that fact, that if you're giving enough money to run Program X can essentially continue without giving it even more money. So that's obviously not true for a single capital improvement. Once that's made, it's done. It doesn't account for the fact that costs may rise, or you may want to enhance programs, but if you do want to give more money, particularly to a program, you're going to want to know what you're doing in addition with that program. It's not just in order to continue the program that exists, because that money is already there.
Can I ask for a clarification?
Yes, please.
I heard one staff person at one point say that this proposed measure would extend Measure J as well, so that there would be an additional component to that. Are we saying there's a commitment or not a commitment to maintain the existing Measure J commitments, that the extension is not going to also be an effort to shift or change the commitments that were made under Measure J?
The assumption going in is Measure J would remain as is. So, no, it would not be extended. So it would sunset in 2034, and this would go. You know, we're just for starting purposes, we're saying 25 years, so that would be 2017 to 2042. So as David's saying, there's a 17-year period where they overlap.
And Sean, Seth, in direct answer to your question, I have heard some discussion that maybe this new measure would also extend J to 2042, but that's certainly no commitment has been made to that, and I think that's a very open question and may not happen. So there could well be an 8-year period where Measure J has sunset, and this still exists. My personal assumption would be that before Measure J sunsets, that it would be placed on the ballot again, say 17 years from now, so you would then have extended the first measure so that they would both continue to exist. But of course, no one can know that. Right. Okay, so then we had Rita and then Kristen.
I just wanted to go back to the complete streets thing with the figures that are here. Was my understanding that some of the RTPCs, or at least WICTEC, moved complete streets into another category. So there's still some money in there. I mean, they have figures in there for them for complete streets somewhere.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if that's in one of these notes here. WICTAC moved TLC into the return to source. So I don't know that they had specifically a complete streets, but they wanted to change the TLC program from now being administered countywide and regionally into being included in the, I think they recommended 28% as return to source. They also wanted some additional, I think it was 5% of the funds were to be spent within a PDA. So at some point in time, I know whether it's with respect to the growth management program or other measures, we'll probably have a discussion here of what do we want that return to source to be. And what do you need to do to get it, and then do you want to put some additional requirements in? For example, Alameda County, they said 15% of the return to source dollars had to go to improvements that benefit bike and ped. So that's not consistent across the board, and WICTAC made that step. Others haven't necessarily done that.
Kristen?
Thank you. I wanted to just jump in and to build on a little bit about what Lisa was saying before, just in terms of making sure that as we think about these percentages, that we do think about creating incentives in order to make these line items become real in terms of implementing and making things better for people in our communities. Because I think we need to be really keep in mind that this is in addition to, there is that 17-year period where both this potential program and this project funding will run contiguous with the Measure J funding. And so, and to the point about, I think that we need to look out for making sure that we significantly increase the line item related to innovation, because we do, and I think Randy Iwasaki in one of our first couple of meetings talked about wanting to look at the measure for the future, not what's in the rearview mirror, because I think that is integral to us being able to do some really significant things, and there is this talk about marquee projects and, the story for the fourth bore of the Caldecott and extending Highway 4 and BART to East Contra Costa were all part of the marquee projects that built up goodwill with the voters. And I think we need to think about how innovation is going to be linked to our ability to achieve some marquee projects. In particular, our members are really concerned about making better, more meaningful connections and increasing the throughput on Highway 4 and on 680, and fully extending the connection so that there is some transformative investments in East Contra Costa, connecting East Contra Costa to Alameda County. So again, to Debbie's point about, who was involved in the RTPC, I am not an engineer, I am not a planner, so we can talk about the percentages and what makes sense for moving things around. But we need a meaningful connection, sort of close the loop, as they say, around Mount Diablo so that we can have significant and meaningful movement of goods and people to keep people working. But did just want to reiterate the point about, I think, meaningful incentives so that the policies align with implementing what we want.
Lisa? Debbie.
I can be Lisa for
No,
a day.
Debbie, sorry.
Only when she was a reporter, not now. So I I want to say that I understand that this would be concurrent for 17 years with the existing measure. However, it's important to note that the existing measure is woefully inadequate to meet the needs of the largest segment of this population, not only now, but in its growth pattern. So it's important to note that, to not say, oh, it's already funded, don't worry about it. It's not already funded. It's inadequately funded, and what is funded inadequately is just a segment of transportation for seniors and people with disabilities, and that is to say it's what is mandated by law, the ADA paratransit. What's not funded is what the need is, which is accessible transportation that takes into account the rider as well as the environment. So being able to do congregate trips, for example, with somebody who can take you through the door and not just to the curb, makes the difference between whether somebody's living in an institution or independently. So these are big sort of topics, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I think to say that we can be bringing in technology infrastructure the way that Uber does rides, we can certainly look at usage patterns on how people need, whether they need lifts in their vehicles or not to get into the vehicle, whether or not they're ambulatory and can be independent. So we can start aggregating that data and building the transportation around the need and not the transportation and maybe we'll meet some need. So I think we could be smarter about the way that we do transportation for senior and people with disabilities. And also want to point out that you have a 0% plan, you have a 1.3% plan, a 1.3% plan, a 1% plan, or no, not that one, a 4% plan, the 0.6%. So there are some that are almost not funding this at all. And I think that the rest of the entire plan hits everybody else except people who have barriers to transportation. And so we need to keep that in the back of our minds when we're planning this, because they may not be the voters who get excited about the Caldecott Tunnel, because the Caldecott Tunnel doesn't mean anything to them.
Joel. Oh, there's the only mic. There you go. Sorry.
Thank you. I want to reiterate what Lisa and Kristen were saying about having stronger incentives. I think that's really what makes a lot of this work in terms of, you know, making the housing development happen in the right places and making transit work and switching our modes of transportation. So reiterating that. And in two ways. One, I think there needs to be an OBAG-like program that needs to have its own line item, which, you know, OBAG is a One Bay Area grant program, is a grant program that's done by through Plan Bay Area by MTC. And it's funded, and it has very specific purposes, and those purposes are to incentivize infill development. So we can go to the nitty-gritties, but the program like that exists already, and happy to share. It is different, yeah. And I can provide documentation of the differences between them. And the other is that many of those performance measures incentives work on all categories. And so I think, you know, it sounds like there's some agreement on that, you know, for instance, we shouldn't just fund every road, but certain roads are good for making certain kinds of transportation improvements. So I think we need to have a little bit of deeper thinking on how we do that, but I strongly encourage us to fund that. The other is I'm happy to see that a regional advanced mitigation program is on this kind of supplementary document here that we see. And it would be great to see the environment focus at least match what is seen as kind of the you know, the standard, which is the San Diego at I think 6%. I don't think we should shortchange Contra Costa in the way that we strategically bundle funding that makes transportation projects go faster. It actually encourages a lot of both conservation work and the right kinds of transportation investments to go forward in an efficient way. So I think, again, it's a program that can help move a lot of these things forward. So I'd like to see that percentage upped.
All right. I do want to pull rank and just ask if there's public comment. We've got about 10 minutes left, and then we can take both Mike and, was it Tim? Did you just have your hand up? Mike and Tim, but are there, and Cheryl, are there, and Seth, are there public comments at this point that people would like to make?
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Peoples. I haven't cleared this with all of my constituents, so I'm just speaking for myself. I want to talk about a very broad vision statement. I want you to remember that the Caltrans 2040, the April draft, which is the current one that's out there, says that if we're going to meet our climate goals, we have to not build any more freeways, we have to double transit usage, we have to double bicycling, and we have to double walking. So my urging to all of you is, as you look at these various percentages and various programs and policies, how do they meet that? How do they not build any freeways, double transit usage, double walking, double biking? And there are lots of details as to how we can do that, but that's where we need to go. And I generally support the Sierra Club Public Advocates version of log rolling, but I think we need to have a clear vision that the log rolling needs to aim us towards.
Thank you. Other public comments? Okay, I don't see any. And it is 10 minutes to 4. I'd like to call on Mike, Tim, Cheryl, and Seth, and then see if we can just talk about next steps, since the meeting will be about end time at that point. Mike?
Yeah, I'll try to run quickly through a short list. So there's been a couple of folks have mentioned incentives and technologies, and as well as a variety of needs that are sort of lightly funded in here, like paratransit, ADA, and such. So the Bay Area Council's point of view and employers' point of view would be that we should look to incentives and technology to cut across the widest possible range of the objectives that we have. So I think we can do more with incentives than just try to get more housing in the right place. We can do more with technology than just try to make arterials work more effectively. And technology being the most interesting one, we don't really know what we're going to have to play with 10 years from now, but we have, I think it's probably a safe bet that it's going to be radically different from what we have today, and it would be useful and appropriate to build in as much flexibility as possible to adjust the expenditure of funds so that, you know, we don't want to be locked in forever to providing paratransit service with cutaway buses that cost a pretty large amount of money to operate if technology and dynamically routed services provided by an entrepreneurial company with a subsidy and vehicles owned by the public sector can get you there more effectively, for example. Our members are big supporters of BART. We'd like to see a significant chunk of money devoted to improving and rehabilitating the existing BART system. Our members recognize that the vast majority of commutes are and will continue to be made by automobile on the highway system, and they support investments to improve the operations of existing highways. Principally, not well knowing these specific projects in Contra Costa County, our members tend as principle to believe in closing gaps in the carpool lane system and in deploying on-highway technology to improve operations. I was really intrigued by Dave's comments about complete streets and them being sometimes done well and providing benefits to pedestrians as bikes as well as to smooth traffic flows, and sometimes done poorly, which makes me think, to the extent that that the expenditure plan sets aside money for complete streets or some category that could be devoted to complete streets, that it's important for the expenditure plan to specify what we want to accomplish with those complete streets investments, and that it only fund the ones that do it well.
Okay, I think we have Tim next.
My comment has to do with the earlier comment when you started to talk about different stakeholder groups, in particular the seniors and disability community. I support that, but if we're going to go down that path, I think we need to also at least put it in public record that we need to think about the fastest growing segment of our population in this county, if not in California, Hispanic Latino community, and how is it that we get them on board to not only embrace the direction we're taking, but to be a user of the different public transportation systems. All I can tell you is that in higher education, with the growing and the changing population that we are seeing here in Contra Costa County, we did have to change the way that we had to approach providing higher education to that particular segment. Not that we're going to lower our standards or anything like that, but I do think that it is, I don't need to say that we have to call it out, but maybe it's embedded in some of the other line items that we have here, but let's just recognize that we have this growing very large segment of our population, and we've got to figure out how to embrace them and get them to participate in our actions.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl, you're next.
So I'm the alternate for the Labor Council and want to make sure that funding for transit operations gets up there as a big priority for us. Bus operations especially, but all transit operations. The only place where it's, well, I guess in the public advocates alternative and the new TEP, it's lined out very specifically for operations. I can't tell from the EIR alternatives, except for bus operations, what amount would be in there, but for the other transit. So the other thing that we want to raise is thinking about performance measurements for job quality. This is public tax dollars, public investment, and we certainly want to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck, both in projects and in operations, that we're creating and maintaining good quality jobs, and that we're not seeing public investments replacing good jobs with jobs that are unstable, and that may not provide the same economic multiplier benefits for the community as transit jobs, for instance, happen now, or construction jobs. So we want to flag that, especially as we're uncertain about certain technologies. So there's been some controversies over Uber and Lyft taking away good jobs from other people that are providing jobs now. So that also could have a negative impact on communities where there's a high number of, whether it's cab drivers, bus drivers. So just want to flag that and measure that going forward.
Okay, great. Seth.
Sorry to be the last one here with maybe a little bit of length, but we're not really nearly ready to talk about percentages yet. We're still interested in talking about sort of visions and goals. But in the same white paper that we've been talking about relative to other stuff, we provided about 10 different things to think about in terms of these, thinking about how to start allocating percentages and what to reinforce. For example, any line allocation to explicitly reinforce the targets of SB 375 and Plan Bay Area's sustainable community strategy, that kind of thing. In looking at the percentages that are here, I wanted to do sort of a clarification too, which is I really respect public advocates in Sierra Club in pushing for adequate environmental review and providing a scenario to do some analysis by. But I'd rather not have that labeled the environmental focus here, because I don't believe there's any consensus in the environmental community or in the transit advocacy community yet about what an environmentally superior alternative would be. There's some general alignment about expanding certain areas and transforming plans, but no consensus. So that I don't want a straw man which makes the environment look bad if we disagree with some things, like, you know, I like ferries, and they're zeroing it out. Another part of this is there's some overlapping categories based on some of these plans being kind of apples and oranges. Some treat administration, for example. Some treat advanced mitigation. And I'd also like to call it advanced mitigation rather than regional advanced mitigation, because there's also a discussion going on about regional advanced mitigation. So, for example, mitigation is part of every project. It doesn't necessarily happen as a separate percentage, but it needs to be front-loaded in order to get the cost savings and efficiencies, just like capital projects got front-loaded in the last measure over some of the programs. And some of these things, again, some of these categories overlap, so they don't necessarily have to add up to 100%. When you get down to some of the other kinds of things, the growth management plans required growth management elements and certain policies be adopted, at least ordinance or resolution. And this measure potentially offers the opportunity to go to the next stage. The most obvious example is cities and jurisdictions adopt complete streets resolutions or ordinances, and this is an opportunity for them to actually prepare the complete streets plans and or have CCTA do it for them and provide substantial funding to start implementing, as Mike says and Lisa says, with some performance standards so that we know that they're going to accomplish what we want them to, but actually provide funding for complete streets projects, for plans and for projects. So we've got a whole section in which we talk about incentive money to address everything from complete streets, bike ped plans, greenhouse gas emissions, transit-oriented development, infill development, affordable housing, and reduction of single occupancy vehicle travel demand. Include a specific funding allocation for local development of these plans, or have CCTA take the lead in working with the cities to help the cities develop those kinds of local plans. And we had some thought about allocating some of these funds based on a combination of competitive per capita and matching requirements to make it an even better incentive. We have trouble following the program money, and for Transit for Livable Communities, for example, some of it got delayed, and we'd like a transparent method to track and report on those performances so we can see how they're doing and make these kinds of decisions better. A big thing that's often missing from these discussions of funding measures is, just based on how you do the bonding, you can have substantial amounts of interest and other kinds of income that are on top of what the measure is talking about. And how do you allocate that? Is it just a slush fund that gets decided by whoever? Or do we actually think in terms of any additional income resulting from this measure should be also allocated based on these percentages, et cetera, et cetera? We really want to push the whole idea of project and program priority and ranking system to incentivize meeting our goals, including especially climate change. So we really want to push the incentive program idea as well, and I want to make a second push about the whole idea of advanced mitigation, because our point here is that, and San Diego, the SANDAG plan was 6%, was that if you're going to actually streamline things, the idea of this is you acquire the land, you acquire the elements necessary to do the mitigation in a coordinated fashion ahead of time. Sometimes we do that with HCPs, for example, habitat conservation plans. You do it ahead of time so that when the project actually starts working, it doesn't have to go through a long regulatory process. It doesn't have to go through a long search for the right elements to do the mitigation. You've already done those things, so it can get its permitting much faster. But that requires front-loading the program with those mitigation dollars. So those are just some ideas, but when you look at our white paper, you'll see quite a few others. And again, those aren't commitments that we have in terms of what should be in the plan. Those are just ideas for the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. It's 5 after 4, so I want to suggest that we try and wrap up, and I want to propose an agenda for next time. I think this has been a great discussion. It's really helped to highlight some items, and I think it's brought up a number of questions that you all are going to want to talk about further. I think that we're going to have a number of reports next time as it is. We're going to get from Martin the evaluation of the 3 EIR alternatives against the 6 or 7 criteria that's mentioned in the action items list. I know that will be an important item for all of you to discuss. We're going to be able to have just further discussion about these 6 options that you have in front of you. On the policy side, we will have the list that you generated today, which Andrew put on the wall over here, accompanied by the paper from Save Mount Diablo and the paper from Professor Liberty, and I think you'll want to talk about ideas there more as well. I'm going to suggest that we not try and create additional items for you beyond those, and that we focus the discussion next time, essentially moving both of these discussions further by looking on the policy side at the questions you've already raised, the ones you've already listed. Oh, and I want to add a number of policy items actually came up here that I want to move over to that policy side. For instance, a possible policy that there be performance measures for job quality, a policy that says that there are guidelines for the quality and impact of projects. Those are really on the policy side as opposed to the dollar side. Want to get those all on a list and maybe try and get that list at least completed by next time. And then on the dollar side, I'd like to just continue the discussion we have now, provide you with additional information, as Joel asked for, well, what does this number of dollars really buy you in this category? How do these differ? Try and get that information to you, and then just continue this discussion. And I'm hopeful then by the end of that meeting on September 28th that we can have enough guidance that then perhaps staff and consultants can create for you, maybe it's 1, maybe it's 2 actual packages that are reflective on the dollar side of what you've talked about and on the policy side of what you've talked about, and bring those back for discussion at the 2 meetings in October. So as short a summary as possible, my proposal is that we give you the information you've asked for, but not anymore, and that we continue the discussion on both of the 2 items where we're leaving it off today, using that additional information that you've already asked for. Is that okay? Yeah, Joel.
Ross, you had mentioned that you were going to give an update at some point on the advanced mitigation work that CCTA is doing as a part of the larger group. Let me know when you.
Yeah, so what we're involved in, so I'm a member of a task team that's looking at regional advanced mitigation. MTC is in the lead of that, thinking about it for their next RTP. Very preliminary. If you would like, whether it's the next meeting or another meeting, Liz is available to come in and discuss it, as well as John Kopchak. Some things that they talk about are probably complementary, others are maybe a little difference of opinion, so we should schedule that. I don't know if the next meeting's the right time or...
If you all want to do it, I'd actually suggest doing it sooner rather than later.
Okay, they're both available at the next meeting.
Is there a consensus of at least many of you that you would like to have that presentation, take another 10, 15 minutes on advanced mitigation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll schedule that for next time also.
One clarification
Yeah.
about what you were suggesting you were going to provide, David, and honestly, I would be curious about your best suggestions of growth management additions as well. You suggested you might have some, but in terms of the programs that have ongoing funding from Measure J, can we get those in a column relative to these scenarios so we know if what we're proposing is an augmentation as opposed to a zero, going from zero? So if Complete Streets has already got X dollar commitment through 2034, what does it mean when we're proposing an expansion of that?
In dollars or percentage?
Well, if you're going to do it in dollars, it's dollars based on Measure J. If you're going to do it as a percentage, I guess it would be a percentage above this existing proposal. So it would be a percentage not included in this 100%, but relative to it.
Could I suggest that the way, I think I understand your question. To me, the easiest way to do this would be actually, if you looked at this chart, well, let me show this chart. If you looked at this chart, for each line item, there'd be an extra column that says, what do we do today? It may actually be in words that says, today we're already, for the topic of bus service, today we're already supporting X, Y, and Z. And that's the question you're asking. And then these additional dollars would do these other things.
If we propose additional dollars for things that are ongoing through 2034, it would be an augmentation on the existing amount.
Right.
But I would like it basically as a third column for each proposal vertically next to the line item it's being discussed for.
Okay. We'll do our best. Yeah. Yeah. We'll get you something. All right. Are we okay with that approach for the meeting on the 28th? We will see you all then. Thank you very much for your time today.